And then we have Cassidy, who is living proof that no matter how much money you pour into a leaky bucket, it still ends up completely empty. Richard's voice boomed through the crystal chandelier ballroom of the Oakridge Country Club. 200 of Connecticut's absolute elite erupted into polite but piercing laughter. I stood dead center in my emerald silk dress, the champagne flute in my hand, perfectly still. I am Cassidy. I am 35 years old, and for 3 decades I have been the designated punching bag of the prestigious Sterling family. But as the laughter washed over me, I did not lower my head. I did not run toward the restroom with tears blurring my vision. Instead, I caught the eye of my husband Nathan standing by the ice sculpture. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, his face a mask of absolute calm because he knew what Richard did not. The man mocking me on stage was about to lose everything he had spent a lifetime building, and I was the one holding the match. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through humiliation while secretly holding the winning hand. The applause finally died down, and Richard stepped off the stage wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. My mother Evelyn rushed to his side, handing him a linen napkin, and beaming like he had just won a Nobel Prize. I placed my glass on a passing waiter's tray and walked directly toward them. The crowd parted slightly, expecting me to offer the usual meek congratulations I had been trained to deliver since childhood. Brilliant speech, Richard. I said, my voice carrying just enough to be heard by the nearby tables, especially the part about leaky buckets. It takes real expertise to recognize financial ruin. My mother's smile snapped shut instantly. Cassidy, lower your voice, she hissed. This is your father's special night. Do not ruin it with your usual sensitivity. Stepfather, I corrected smoothly. And I am not being sensitive, Mother. I am just admiring his incredible confidence. It takes a lot of nerve to stand in front of your investors and crack jokes when Sterling Enterprises is drowning in undisclosed debt. Richard's face lost a fraction of its color, but he quickly recovered, plastering on his trademark condescending smirk. Still playing pretend businesswoman, I see. I told you Cassidy running a small online boutique does not mean you understand corporate finance. Let the adults handle the real money. My golden child sister Vanessa materialized beside us, linking her arm through Richard's. Honestly, Cass, she sighed, adjusting her heavy diamond necklace. You always do this. Richard just announced his retirement and passed the CEO baton to my husband, and you have to make it about yourself. Just because your little crafts shop is struggling does not mean Sterling Enterprises is. Actually, Vanessa, Nathan said, stepping up to stand beside me. His presence was a solid, comforting wall of support. Cassidy's boutique cleared 7 figures last quarter. But we are not here to talk about her massive success. Richard let out a sharp, barking laugh that echoed uncomfortably in the quiet space around us. 7 figures. Please, you two are practically begging for handouts every Thanksgiving. If you had real money, you would not be wearing last season's dress to my retirement gala. I looked down at my dress, running a hand over the smooth silk. I had bought it vintage on purpose, a subtle nod to the sustainability brand I had built from the ground up. A brand they knew absolutely nothing about, because they never bothered to ask a single question about my life. The dress is vintage, Richard, I said, meeting his arrogant gaze. Much like your business model. Outdated, wearing thin, and about to fall apart at the seams. Evelyn grabbed my arm, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. That is enough. You are embarrassing the family. Apologize to Richard immediately, or you can leave. For years, that exact threat had worked. The fear of being cast out, of being the ungrateful daughter, had kept me silent and compliant. I vividly remembered being 16 years old, standing in the grand foyer of our mansion, holding an acceptance letter for a prestigious art and design program. Richard had snatched it from my hands, tossed it into the burning fireplace, and told me I was too mediocre to survive in a creative field. Evelyn had simply watched, sipping her tea, telling me to be practical and take the entry-level clerical job Richard offered at his firm. I had spent my entire youth swallowing their insults, shrinking myself to fit into the tiny, suffocating box they built for me. But tonight, that box was breaking wide open. I gently but firmly removed my mother's hand from my arm. I will not apologize for stating facts. And as for leaving, I think I will stay right here. I want a front row seat for the main event. Richard narrowed his eyes, a flicker of genuine worry, finally breaking through his arrogance. What are you talking about? Before I could answer, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom swung open with a loud thud. A group of men in sharp dark suits entered, their severe demeanor entirely at odds with the celebratory party atmosphere. At the front of the pack was Harrison Vance, the lead auditor for the State Financial Regulatory Board. I knew Harrison very well. We had been quietly collaborating in secret for the past 6 months. The murmurs in the room swelled as Harrison bypassed the greeting line and walked straight toward Richard. The string quartet stopped playing mid-measure, leaving a heavy, oppressive silence in their wake. Richard Sterling Harrison said, his voice cutting clearly through the silent room. "We need to have a word about the offshore accounts linked to the Sterling Enterprises Employee Pension Fund." Richard's confident posture vanished instantly, replaced by sheer panic. He looked at Harrison, then at the federal auditors fanning out across the room, securing the exits, and finally at me. "What did you do?" he hissed, his voice dropping to a venomous, trembling whisper. "I just patched the leaky bucket," I replied, holding his furious gaze without blinking. "You see, Richard, when you handed me that low-level clerical job 15 years ago to keep me under your thumb, you made one massive miscalculation." "What miscalculation?" Evelyn demanded, her voice shrill with confusion and rising terror. I smiled, the kind of smile that reaches the eyes and settles deep in the bones. "You gave me access to the company archives, and unlike you, I actually read the fine print." Vanessa stepped forward, her face flushed with pure anger. "You reported him. You turned in your own family. You are an absolute monster, Cassidy. Family protects each other." I told my sister, my voice calm and completely steady. "Richard stole from his own employees to fund your lavish lifestyle, Vanessa. He stole from the hard-working people who trusted him. I am just returning the favor on their behalf." The lead auditor stepped closer, formally requesting that Richard accompany them to a private room for questioning. The 200 wealthy guests, the elite society that had just laughed at my expense minutes ago, were now whispering frantically, pulling out their phones, and physically distancing themselves from the Sterling family as quickly as possible. As Richard was escorted away by federal agents, his legacy crumbling to dust in real time, my mother turned to me with tears of pure rage streaming down her face. "You have ruined us! You have ruined everything we built!" "No, Mother," I said, turning to leave with Nathan close by my side. "I just leveled the playing field, and believe me, I am only just getting started." The heavy wooden doors of the ballroom closed behind us, muffling the sounds of my family's collapsing empire. The cool night air felt like absolute freedom against my skin. But as we walked to our car in the dimly lit parking lot, Nathan's phone buzzed with an urgent text message. He looked at the glowing screen, and his perfectly calm demeanor finally cracked. "Cassidy," he said, holding up the phone with a shaking hand. "We have a massive problem. Richard knew the auditors were coming tonight. He transferred the remaining stolen funds this morning." I stopped dead in my tracks in the middle of the parking lot, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Transferred them where?" Nathan looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "Into a shell account registered legally in your name." But to understand how my own name ended up on that fraudulent shell account, I have to take you back exactly 45 minutes. Let us rewind to the moment right after Richard finished his humiliating speech about the leaky bucket. Before the federal agents breached the heavy oak doors, and before the entire Sterling Empire collapsed in front of high society, I had to survive the dinner table. After Richard made his laughter-inducing punchline at my expense, I made my way back to table 42. Of course, I was not seated at the head table with the rest of the immediate family. I was banished to the overflow section near the kitchen swinging doors. This was the table reserved for the lesser important guests, where I was seated with my cousin DeAndre, his new wife Brittany, and my Aunt Patricia. As I approached my assigned chair, the sting of Richard's public insult still hung heavy in the air, but I kept my posture perfectly straight. The Oakridge Country Club was a fortress of old money, and the air smelled heavily of roasted duck, expensive perfume, and overwhelming arrogance. I just wanted to sit down, catch my breath, and wait for my meticulously planned domino effect to begin. Before I could even pull my chair out to sit down, the conflict overlapped. Brittany leaned across the table, her heavy gold bracelets clinking aggressively against the fine china. She did not even bother to look me in the eye. Instead, she aggressively shoved her empty crystal champagne flute directly into my hand, forcing me to grip the delicate stem or let it shatter on the marble floor. "Be a dear, and go find the waitstaff for us," Brittany said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "You are so used to fetching things for everyone anyway, and my glass has been empty for 5 whole minutes." I stood there feeling the cold crystal against my palm. 10 years ago, the 25-year-old version of Cassidy would have taken the glass without a single word of protest. I would have scurried off toward the kitchen doors, eager to prove my usefulness, desperate to earn a tiny scrap of approval from a family that viewed me as nothing more than the hired help. I would have swallowed the humiliation, told myself it was just a small favor, and returned with a fresh bottle of champagne, only to be ignored for the rest of the evening. That was the role they had written for me, the quiet, obedient shadow, who existed only to make their lives slightly more convenient. But I was not that girl anymore. I looked at Brittany, really looked at her. She was wearing a custom designer gown, paid for by the very company funds I knew were currently being investigated by the state. She was arrogant, oblivious, and entirely dependent on a financial house of cards that was scheduled to blow away in less than 10 minutes. I did not say a single word to her. I maintained unbroken eye contact, my expression completely neutral, and I slowly lowered my hand. I set the empty champagne flute down on the table, placing it deliberately out of her reach. I pushed it just far enough away that if she wanted it refilled, she would have to get up and do it herself. Brittany gasped dramatically, clutching her diamond necklace, as if I had just slapped her across the face. "Excuse me," she sputtered, her face turning a blotchy shade of red. "I asked you to do a simple favor." "It is not my job to serve you, Brittany," I said quietly, finally taking my seat and smoothing my vintage emerald dress over my knees. "If you are thirsty, you know exactly where the bar is." DeAndre let out a loud, mocking laugh that immediately drew the attention of the neighboring table. The adjacent table happened to be seated with 3 of Sterling Enterprises' top-tier investors. These were older men in sharp tuxedos who held millions of dollars in the company. DeAndre saw his audience and immediately played to the crowd, eager to assert his dominance. "Oh, leave her alone, Britt," DeAndre said, his voice carrying effortlessly over the low hum of the ballroom chatter. "You have to forgive Cassidy. She is just a glorified secretary who likes to play dress-up. She does not understand how high-level business works or how to properly network at these luxury events." The investors at the next table turned their heads, their expressions a mix of mild curiosity and elite amusement. DeAndre leaned toward them, resting his elbows on the table like a seasoned insider sharing a highly confidential corporate secret. "My cousin here runs a little online crafts project," DeAndre explained to the wealthy men, waving his hand dismissively in my direction. "We let her think she is an entrepreneur because it keeps her busy and out of trouble. But when it comes to actual corporate strategy, risk management, or managing real capital, she is completely out of her depth. That is why Richard keeps her far away from the board meetings. You cannot have someone with a small-time mentality handling millions of dollars." One of the investors chuckled politely, taking a slow sip of his expensive scotch. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a deeply suppressed righteous anger. DeAndre had never worked a hard day in his entire life. He was handed a vice president title at Sterling Enterprises simply for sharing the family bloodline. I knew for a fact that he spent his days playing golf on company time and his nights expensing luxury dinners to the corporate account. Yet here he was, publicly reducing my 7-figure self-funded software and design business to a little crafts project just to make himself look bigger in front of the men holding the purse strings. I turned my head slowly and locked eyes with the investor who had chuckled. It is true, I said, my voice clear and melodic, projecting just enough to reach their table. I do not understand DeAndre's version of high-level business. For example, my little project actually generates a genuine profit without relying on a hidden line of credit to make weekly payroll. But I suppose true corporate strategy is just looking wealthy while the ship quietly sinks to the bottom of the ocean, right? DeAndre. The investor stopped smiling immediately. DeAndre's confident posture stiffened, his jaw clenching so tightly I could see a vein pulsing in his neck. What exactly is that supposed to mean, Cassidy? He demanded, the playful arrogance completely gone from his tone, replaced by a sudden flash of insecurity. Before I could deliver the final blow, my Aunt Patricia leaned violently across the table. Patricia was the self-appointed matriarch of the extended family, a woman who valued public appearances above absolutely everything else, including basic human decency. She reached out and grabbed my wrist beneath the table, her carefully manicured fingernails digging into my skin with surprising force. Cassidy, stop this right now, Patricia whispered aggressively, her face inches from mine. Her voice was a venomous hiss that only our table could hear. You are embarrassing the family in front of the board members. How dare you sit here and bite the hand that graciously feeds you? I looked down at her hand clamped firmly around my wrist. It was the exact same grip she used when I was 12 years old and dared to ask for a second piece of cake at a family holiday gathering. It was the physical grip that told me to stay in my place, to be small, to be invisible, and to never step out of line. You are a massive disgrace, Patricia continued, her eyes wide with frantic, unyielding anger. Richard generously allows you to attend this gala. He gives you a seat at our table, and you repay him by acting like a spoiled, ungrateful brat. If you say one more word to insult DeAndre or this company, I will personally see to it that you are cut out of every family event, every holiday, and every single trust fund distribution from here on out. Do you understand me? She thought she held the ultimate power over me. She truly believed that the threat of being cut off from the Sterling family money and social status was the ultimate weapon that would force me back into submission. What Patricia did not realize was that I had stopped wanting their toxic money a decade ago. And as of tonight, there would be no trust funds left to distribute anyway. I did not pull my arm away. I simply looked at Patricia with a profound sense of genuine pity. It must be so exhausting, Aunt Patricia, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but heavy with absolute certainty. It must be so incredibly tiring to spend your entire life polishing a brass trophy, trying to convince the rest of the world that it is made of solid gold. Patricia's eyes narrowed in deep confusion. She loosened her grip slightly, completely caught off guard by my total lack of fear. I gently but firmly pulled my wrist free from her hand and sat back comfortably in my chair. You do not have to worry about cutting me out, Patricia, I told her, picking up my crystal water glass and taking a slow, calm sip. Because after tonight, there will not be a family left to invite me to dinner. And as for the board members sitting right next to us, I highly suggest they start calling their defense lawyers first thing in the morning. The silence at table 42 became absolute and suffocating. Brittany forgot to be offended about her empty champagne glass. DeAndre stared at me with a complex mixture of intense hatred and sudden creeping doubt. Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the very first time in 35 years, I had completely paralyzed them with nothing but the unvarnished truth. I sat there in the tense silence, feeling completely at peace with myself. I knew that in just a few minutes Harrison Vance and his team of federal auditors would walk through those ballroom doors and change our lives forever. I knew that the grand illusion of the Sterling family was about to shatter into a million irreparable pieces right in front of their eyes. I just had to wait for the show to begin. But the horrifying revelation I would soon face in the dark parking lot with my husband was still waiting for me, perfectly hidden in the shadows of my triumphant moment. As I sat there in the tense silence of table 42, waiting for the federal auditors to finally breach the ballroom doors, my mind drifted back to exactly how this absurd delusion had started. How had my entire family convinced themselves that I was nothing more than a glorified secretary? The answer lay exactly 3 months in the past during the annual Sterling family Christmas dinner. It was a memory that perfectly encapsulated the suffocating dynamic I was about to completely destroy. The Christmas dinner was held at Richard and Evelyn's sprawling estate in Connecticut. The house was decorated with aggressive, towering perfection. A 12-foot imported fir tree dominated the grand living room, draped in thousands of crystal ornaments that caught the light of the massive stone fireplace. The dining table was set for 20, groaning under the weight of sterling silver platters, expensive cuts of prime rib and vintage wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent. But despite the warmth of the roaring fire and the holiday music playing softly through the hidden speakers, the atmosphere was freezing cold. I was seated at the far end of the table, naturally right next to the drafty window. At the head of the table, Richard was holding his wineglass high, his face flushed with the arrogance of a man who believed he was utterly untouchable. He clinked his knife against the crystal to demand everyone's absolute attention. "I want to make a special toast this evening," Richard had announced, his voice booming over the quiet hum of holiday conversation. "To DeAndre and Brittany. This week, they successfully closed the Apex Logistics contract. It is a $1 million deal that will secure Sterling Enterprises for the next fiscal year. They have shown incredible initiative, exactly the kind of aggressive ambition this family is known for." The table erupted into applause. My Aunt Patricia DeAndre's mother beamed with such intense pride she looked like she might practically burst. Brittany flipped her perfectly styled hair over her shoulder and offered a modest, completely practiced smile, while DeAndre puffed out his chest and accepted the praise, as if he had just conquered a small nation. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting a piece of prime rib with slow, deliberate precision. The absolute irony of the moment was almost too heavy to digest. I knew all about the Apex Logistics contract. I knew about it because Apex was a subsidiary of my own software development firm. DeAndre had not negotiated a brilliant deal. He had frantically signed a heavily marked-up licensing agreement for my custom supply chain management software because Sterling Enterprises was bleeding money through massive operational inefficiencies. He had no idea he was signing a contract that directly funneled Sterling capital right into my corporate accounts. To him, the vendor was just a faceless tech conglomerate. But I let them have their applause. I took a sip of my sparkling water and remained entirely silent. Unfortunately, my silence was never quite enough for Patricia. She always needed a stark contrast to highlight her son's supposed brilliance, and I was her absolute favorite dark background. Patricia leaned forward, her heavy diamond earrings swinging. She looked directly down the length of the table at me, her eyes narrowing with predatory focus. "Cassidy, dear," Patricia called out, ensuring the entire table stopped talking to listen to her. "You should really take meticulous notes from your cousin. Closing $1 million deal takes real skill. It is a massive shame you never developed that kind of business acumen." I looked up, meeting her gaze evenly. "I am very happy for DeAndre, Aunt Patricia. It sounds like a critical contract for the company." Patricia waved her manicured hand dismissively, clearly uninterested in my polite response. "Well, since we are on the topic of logistics and planning, I have a small task for you. As you all know, the family is heading to Aspen for our annual ski trip in February. We are staying at the St. Regis, but the reservations team has been incredibly stubborn about upgrading our suites to the penthouse level." Patricia paused, taking a slow sip of her red wine before delivering her ultimate demand. "Since you spend your entire day booking flights, organizing calendars, and running basic errands for your little bosses, you must have some low-level administrative contacts. I want you to call the hotel tomorrow morning, use your secretary perks or whatever customer service tricks you people use, and secure those suite upgrades for us. Make sure DeAndre and Brittany get the corner room with the mountain view. They have earned it." The entire table stared at me, waiting for my usual quiet compliance. For years, they had assigned me these degrading chores: picking up dry cleaning, calling customer service lines, organizing their chaotic itineraries. They genuinely believed that because my startup was based out of a home office in its early days, I was simply doing remote clerical work for someone else. I placed my silver fork down on the porcelain plate. The soft clink sounded incredibly loud in the sudden quiet of the large dining room. "I'm afraid I cannot do that, Aunt Patricia," I said, my voice completely steady and calm. Patricia's smug smile instantly vanished, replaced by a deep, highly offended scowl. "Excuse me, what do you mean you cannot do it? It is a simple phone call, Cassidy. It is literally what you do for a living." "No, it is not," I replied, holding her furious gaze without blinking. "I do not work in administration, and I certainly do not have secretary perks at luxury hotels. If you want a penthouse suite in Aspen, I highly suggest you call the concierge and pay the premium upgrade fee yourselves. I am not your personal assistant." The collective gasp around the table was entirely audible. My mother Evelyn dropped her linen napkin onto her lap, her face paling with immediate embarrassment. "Cassidy, apologize to your aunt right now," she hissed from across the table. "How dare you ruin Christmas dinner with this incredibly selfish attitude?" "I am not being selfish, Mother," I stated clearly. "I am simply setting a firm boundary. I run my own business. I do not have the time or the inclination to fight with hotel staff over room upgrades for a luxury trip I was not even invited on." That was the exact match that lit the powder keg. Patricia slammed her hand flat against the mahogany table, making the expensive crystal wine glasses rattle ominously. "Run your own business." Patricia laughed, a harsh, grating sound completely devoid of any real amusement. "Please, Cassidy, do not insult our intelligence. Selling homemade trinkets on the internet or typing up spreadsheets in your pajamas does not make you a CEO. It makes you a hobbyist who absolutely refuses to get a real job." She stood up slightly, leaning over the table to ensure every venomous word hit its intended mark. "Look at Brittany," Patricia demanded, gesturing wildly toward her daughter-in-law. "She is 28 years old and she is a partner in $1 million corporate acquisition. She understands high-level negotiations. She understands the heavy weight of the Sterling family name. And what exactly do you understand? You are 35 years old, wearing off-the-rack clothing and refusing to do a simple favor for the family that graciously puts a roof over your head. You have always been a massive disappointment to this family. Cassidy." Patricia continued, her voice rising to a theatrical, piercing crescendo. "When you were young, we thought you were just a late bloomer. But now it is perfectly clear. You simply lack ambition. You have no drive, no vision, and no concept of family loyalty. You are perfectly content to scrape by at the absolute bottom of the barrel while the rest of us carry the heavy burden of real success." The dining room was dead silent. Even Richard looked slightly uncomfortable with the sheer intensity of Patricia's unhinged tirade. Brittany looked down at her lap, hiding a highly satisfied smirk behind her wine glass. DeAndre watched me with a look of supreme victory, relishing the fact that his mother was publicly dismantling my dignity to build him up. I sat there absorbing every single word. I felt the familiar heavy weight of their collective disdain pressing down on my chest. It was the same weight I had carried since childhood. The weight of being the designated failure, the person they could all point to and say, "At least I am not her." But as I looked around that opulent, suffocating dining room 3 months ago, I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the need to desperately defend myself, to scream that my supposed hobby had just bought a massive commercial office building in downtown Seattle, or that the contract they were currently celebrating was actually funding my corporate retirement portfolio. Instead, I felt a deep, profound sense of finality. As Patricia finally sat back down, breathless and vibrating with righteous anger, I realized that I no longer wanted their approval. Let them believe I was a failed secretary. Let them believe they were the absolute titans of industry. The higher the grand pedestal they built for themselves, the more devastating the fall would be when I finally kicked the main pillar out from under them. That Christmas dinner was the exact moment I stopped being their quiet victim and started becoming their ultimate architect. I slowly returned my attention to the present moment at the Oakridge Country Club, the painful memory of Patricia's harsh voice, fading into the low hum of the gala ballroom. I looked at the heavy oak doors, knowing the trap I had patiently built over the last 3 months was about to violently snap shut. But the absolute defining moment of that Christmas night did not actually end at the mahogany dining table. While I was sitting there absorbing the full force of Patricia's unhinged venom, my husband Nathan was fighting his own quiet battle just a few rooms away. Shortly before Patricia had launched her attack on my supposed lack of ambition, Nathan had politely excused himself from the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room to grab a fresh pitcher of ice water from the kitchen. Evelyn's kitchen was a sprawling masterpiece of white marble and stainless steel designed entirely for expensive catered events rather than actual home cooking. It was completely empty and sterile, offering a temporary sanctuary from the clinking crystal and inflated egos echoing down the hallway. Nathan stood by the massive center island, filling the heavy crystal pitcher, taking a brief moment to just breathe and escape the relentless judgment of my family. The heavy swinging door suddenly pushed open, and DeAndre strolled in. He was riding the absolute high of his newly announced logistics contract, a heavy pour of expensive bourbon sloshing in his glass. His face was flushed, his expensive silk tie loosened, projecting the exact image of a Wall Street titan who had just conquered the financial world. He leaned heavily against the marble counter, deliberately blocking Nathan's path back to the dining room. Hiding out with the hired help, DeAndre asked, a cruel, mocking smirk playing on his lips. "I guess I do not blame you for needing a break. The conversation out there is about real capital and aggressive corporate strategy. It must be incredibly boring for a guy who spends his days inspecting concrete and filing municipal building permits." Nathan, who worked as a senior structural engineer for the city, simply capped the water pitcher. He was a man of quiet, unshakable confidence, completely immune to the superficial posturing of the Sterling family. He wiped a single drop of condensation from the glass and offered DeAndre a polite, totally indifferent smile. "Someone has to make sure the foundations are actually solid," Nathan replied smoothly. "Otherwise, the whole building eventually comes crashing down on everyone inside." DeAndre laughed loudly, entirely missing the profound metaphor. "Right. Well, speaking of solid foundations, I actually followed you in here to do you a massive favor, because I am a generous guy and frankly, it is getting a little pathetic watching you and Cassidy scrape by while the rest of the family operates on a completely different level of wealth." DeAndre took a slow, arrogant sip of his bourbon, leaning in closer to Nathan. He lowered his voice, attempting to sound like an exclusive financial insider, offering a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. "I manage a private side fund," DeAndre whispered, glancing at the kitchen door, as if sharing a highly classified state secret. "Highly exclusive. It is completely off the books from Sterling Enterprises, just a little aggressively managed portfolio I run for my high net worth friends. I am generating a solid 20% quarterly return. I know you two probably only have a few measly thousands sitting in a low-yield savings account, but if you give it to me, I can double your net worth in 6 months. Think of it as my generous Christmas gift to the struggling branch of the family." Nathan looked at him, his highly analytical mind instantly catching the glaring, desperate inconsistencies. A man who had just supposedly closed $1 million corporate deal should not be cornering his cousin's husband in a kitchen to solicit a few $1,000s in personal savings. It reeked of absolute terrifying desperation. It was the frantic, sweeping behavior of a man trying to cover a massive bleeding deficit before the end of the fiscal year. "I deeply appreciate the thought," Nathan said, his voice smooth and entirely unbothered by the condescension. "But Cassidy and I are perfectly comfortable with our current financial strategy. We strictly prefer low-risk investments with complete transparency. We will have to respectfully pass on your private fund." DeAndre's fake camaraderie vanished in an instant. The amber liquid splashed against the side of his glass as his grip tightened in sudden rage. His massive ego, incredibly fragile and completely dependent on constant validation, could not handle a simple, polite rejection from a man he considered vastly inferior. "Comfortable." DeAndre scoffed loudly, stepping right into Nathan's personal space, trying to use his height for physical intimidation. You are a public employee driving a 5-year-old sedan, and your wife sells internet crafts from a spare bedroom. That is not comfortable, Nathan. That is absolute financial impotence. It is honestly embarrassing to watch. You sit at our luxury table eating our expensive food, drinking our vintage wine, and you do not even have the basic hustle to provide a decent life for Cassidy. DeAndre sneered, pointing a finger directly at Nathan's chest. If you were half a man, you would be begging me on your knees to let you into this exclusive fund. You are riding the coattails of the prestigious Sterling family name without contributing a single dime to the legacy. You are a financial parasite. Nathan did not flinch. He did not raise his voice, nor did he break his calm eye contact. He just looked at DeAndre with the exact same clinical detached pity a scientist might reserve for a struggling trapped insect. DeAndre, Nathan said softly, the quiet, unshakable authority in his voice completely dominating the large kitchen. A man who is truly wealthy does not need to loudly announce his net worth at the dinner table to force applause. And a man whose business is actually thriving does not corner his family members in the kitchen, begging for their meager savings to quietly patch a gaping hole he dug for himself. DeAndre froze, his eyes widening in shock. I do not know what kind of massive financial trouble you are currently hiding. Nathan continued, his tone perfectly even. But I strongly suggest you find a much better way to clean it up. Because whatever delicate house of cards you are building, the wind is already blowing and your foundation is already crumbling. The color drained entirely from DeAndre's face, leaving him a sickly pale white. For a fraction of a second, the arrogant, untouchable facade completely shattered, revealing the terrified, drowning fraud underneath. He opened his mouth to shout, to hurl another loud barrage of insults, but no sound came out. Nathan simply stepped around him, picked up the heavy crystal water pitcher, and walked calmly toward the swinging door. As Nathan pushed through the door to return to the dining room, DeAndre violently threw his glass against the stainless steel sink. The expensive crystal shattered into a dozen sharp, jagged pieces. A violent but incredibly pathetic display of a man losing total control of his constructed reality. Nathan returned to his seat right next to me, just as Patricia was reaching the dramatic, screaming climax of her speech about my lack of ambition. He casually poured ice water into my glass, his hand perfectly steady, betraying zero emotion. He gave me a single knowing look that communicated absolutely everything I needed to know. The Sterlings were not just exceptionally cruel, they were completely broke. They were drowning in secret debt, scrambling for loose change, and wearing designer clothes to hide the fact that their entire empire was built on stolen air. That kitchen encounter was the exact moment Nathan and I realized we were not just dealing with toxic family dynamics and bad behavior. We were dealing with desperate, cornered criminals willing to do anything to survive. And as we stood in the dimly lit Oakridge Country Club parking lot 3 months later, the cool night air wrapping around us, staring at the horrifying text message on Nathan's phone, the full crushing weight of their desperation finally made terrifying sense. Richard had not just stolen the employee pension funds to sustain their lavish lifestyle. He had expertly funneled the stolen millions through a complex web of fake, untraceable shell accounts, completely bypassing his own name to avoid federal detection. And when he somehow realized the state financial auditors were closing in on his massive fraud, he made his final, most devastating move. He took the largest sum of stolen money and legally registered the final holding account under the name of the one person the family had always used as their personal scapegoat. He framed me. He framed me. The horrifying words hung in the freezing parking lot air, heavy and suffocating. Richard had not just stolen millions of dollars from his own employees, he had actively designed a legal trapdoor with my exact name on it. He thought he had outsmarted the state auditors and secured his own golden parachute at the cost of my absolute freedom. But as genuine panic flashed across Nathan's face in the glow of the phone screen, I did not break down. I did not scream or drop to my knees in despair. I just looked at my husband and smiled a cold, razor-sharp smile. because Richard thought he was framing the helpless, quiet secretary he constantly mocked at the dinner table. He had absolutely no idea who he was actually dealing with. To understand why I was not terrified of Richard's pathetic frame job, you have to see exactly what happened the morning after that disastrous Christmas dinner. The morning of December 26th, exactly 3 months before the country club gala, was the day I stopped playing defense and finally went on the offensive. When I woke up that morning, I did not log into a low-level administrative portal from my living room couch. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, kissed Nathan goodbye, and drove directly into the heart of the downtown financial district. I pulled my car into the VIP underground garage of the towering glass and steel monolith that dominated the city skyline. I bypassed the crowded lobby, entirely swiped a solid black biometric keycard, and stepped into a private express elevator. There were no buttons to press. The elevator recognized my credentials and shot straight up to the top floor. When the polished steel doors glided open, I did not step into a cramped cubicle. I stepped into the sprawling, sunlit penthouse suite of Vanguard Acquisitions. I walked past the massive frosted glass logo and the bustling floor of high-level executives and financial analysts immediately quieted down out of deep, genuine respect. "Good morning, Cassidy," my executive assistant Sarah said, falling into step beside me and handing me a perfectly hot black coffee and a thick leather-bound dossier. "The department heads are already waiting for you in the main boardroom." "Thank you, Sarah," I replied, taking the coffee and walking toward the heavy glass doors of the primary conference room. "I am the Chief Executive Officer and sole founder of Vanguard Acquisitions, a multi-million-dollar corporate restructuring and investment firm. Over the last 10 years, I had ruthlessly built an absolute empire, acquiring struggling regional companies, optimizing their supply chains, and flipping them for massive, unprecedented profits. I controlled millions in liquid capital, employed hundreds of brilliant people, and sat on the board of 3 major philanthropic foundations. So why did my own family believe I was a struggling secretary selling homemade crafts on the internet? Because I intentionally designed it that way. Growing up in the Sterling household taught me one incredibly painful, vital lesson. If they knew you loved something, they would find a way to destroy it. When I was 14, I discovered a deep passion for competitive chess. I studied for months and qualified for the state championship. The day before the tournament, my mother threw away my customized chess set because my sister Vanessa needed the desk space for her new makeup vanity. When I was 19, I launched a highly profitable tutoring business on my college campus. As soon as Richard found out it was generating real money, he manipulated my bank accounts legally, claimed the business as a subsidiary of his own company, and liquidated all of my hard-earned assets to help pay for DeAndre's luxury sports car. My family did not just view my success as a threat, they viewed it as a communal resource to be plundered for their own selfish desires. They demanded absolute mediocrity from me so they could feel vastly superior. So when I started building the software platforms that would eventually become Vanguard Acquisitions, I buried my name behind layers of ironclad LLCs and blind trusts. I drove a modest car. I wore vintage clothes. I played the role of the quiet, struggling disappointment, perfectly using their massive arrogance as a camouflage to build a fortress they could never touch. Silence was not just a preference, it was my absolute armor. I pushed open the glass doors of the boardroom and took my seat at the head of the long mahogany table. My chief operating officer, Marcus, a brilliant former Wall Street shark, was already standing by the massive digital presentation screen. My lead financial analyst, Elena, sat to my right, tapping rapidly on her tablet. "Let us get straight to it," I said, setting my coffee down. "Marcus, give me the morning update." Marcus tapped the screen, and the familiar corporate logo of Sterling Enterprises flashed in brilliant color. "As you requested last night, Cassidy, we have run a complete aggressive diagnostic on the target. Sterling Enterprises is currently bleeding cash at a catastrophic rate. They are highly leveraged, their core assets are completely tied up in bad loans, and their operational efficiency is a total nightmare. And the Apex Logistics contract, I asked, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. Elena smiled sharply. They signed it yesterday. DeAndre pushed the paperwork through without doing a single background check on the parent company. He has absolutely no idea that Apex is a direct subsidiary of Vanguard Acquisitions. By signing that heavily marked up contract, Sterling Enterprises essentially handed us the keys to their remaining cash flow. We now control their entire shipping infrastructure. Excellent, I said, feeling a deep, highly satisfying thrill of victory. But we are not stopping at the supply chain. I want to buy the ground they walk on. Marcus, I want you to authorize the immediate acquisition of all their outstanding commercial debt. Go through our secondary blind trusts. Buy their warehouse mortgages, acquire the loans on their corporate headquarters, and buy out their primary equipment creditors. I want Vanguard to be the sole entity holding the paper on their entire miserable existence. Marcus nodded, taking rapid notes. Consider it done. But Cassidy, there is a massive anomaly we discovered while auditing their recent financial disclosures. Elena, show her. Elena swiped her tablet, and a complex spreadsheet appeared on the screen, highlighted with bright red warning markers. While we were tracing their debt, we noticed a huge glaring discrepancy in the Sterling Enterprises Employee Pension Fund. Millions of dollars have been quietly siphoned out over the last 3 years and funneled into offshore holding accounts. Richard is not just making bad business decisions. He is actively embezzling from his own workers to artificially inflate the company's value and fund his personal lifestyle. The boardroom went completely silent. Marcus and Elena looked at me, waiting for my directive. This was no longer just a hostile corporate takeover. This was uncovering a massive federal crime. The memory of Richard holding his wine glass the night before, boasting about his brilliant legacy while secretly robbing his own employees blind, filled me with a cold, absolute rage. Document everything, I ordered, my voice dangerously quiet. Trace every single stolen dollar. Map the offshore accounts, find the exact routing numbers, and build an airtight, undeniable portfolio of evidence. Are we taking this to the corporate board? Marcus asked carefully. No, I replied, standing up from my chair and looking directly at the glaring red numbers on the screen. The board is completely compliant and just as corrupt. We are taking this to the federal government. Get me Harrison Vance from the State Financial Regulatory Board on the phone immediately. We are going to hand him the biggest fraud case of his career on a silver platter. As my team immediately sprang into action, dialing the federal regulators and initiating the aggressive debt buyout, I looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. My family had spent my entire life trying to keep me at the absolute bottom. They thought I was a harmless, leaky bucket they could kick around for their own amusement. But as I stood in my penthouse office, orchestrating the complete and total annihilation of their corrupt empire, I knew the ultimate truth. I was not a leaky bucket. I was the absolute flood that was about to drown them all. The weeks following that decisive morning in my penthouse office became a blur of aggressive corporate warfare. My team at Vanguard Acquisitions operated with the precision of a highly trained military strike force. While the rest of the Sterling family spent their January and February planning their lavish Aspen vacation and preparing for Richard's grand retirement gala, we were quietly dismantling their empire brick by invisible brick. We bought their warehouse mortgages. We acquired their equipment leases. We systematically became the sole entity standing between Sterling Enterprises and total financial ruin. But the most devastating weapon in our arsenal did not come from the hostile debt takeover. It came directly from the forensic audit. It was late on a Thursday evening, just 2 weeks before the Oakridge Country Club gala. The Vanguard offices were mostly empty, the city lights reflecting off the glass walls of my boardroom. I was reviewing the final acquisition paperwork when Elena, my lead financial analyst, knocked gently on the open door. She was not holding her usual sleek digital tablet. Instead, she was carrying a thick physical manila folder. In the world of high-level digital finance, a physical file meant only one thing. The discovery was too sensitive, too explosive to risk leaving a digital footprint before it was absolutely verified. Cassidy, you need to see this right now, Elena said, her voice dropping a full octave. She walked over and dropped the heavy folder directly onto the center of my mahogany desk. I closed my laptop and looked at the grim expression on her face. Is it more evidence on Richard's pension embezzlement? I asked, reaching for the file. Elena shook her head slowly. No. Richard is stealing from the employees, which we already proved. But this is completely different. This is why the company is actually hemorrhaging cash at an unrecoverable rate. It is an internal parasite. We started digging into the vendor contracts and the operational expenses over the last 4 years, specifically focusing on the million-dollar deals your family loves to brag about. I opened the folder, and my eyes immediately fell upon a dense stack of printed ledgers, bank routing numbers, and state business registration forms. They are entirely fake, Elena stated, pulling out a specific document and placing it in front of me. The massive logistics contracts, the brilliant corporate acquisitions, the strategic partnerships, all of it. DeAndre and Brittany, along with your sister Vanessa and her husband, have been running a highly coordinated, massive embezzlement ring right under Richard's nose. I stared at the paperwork, my mind racing, as the puzzle pieces finally snapped together with sickening clarity. I looked at the names of the vendors listed on the invoices. Horizon Consulting, Summit Logistics, Apex Global Solutions. They set up a network of ghost corporations, I said, tracing the fraudulent billing addresses with my finger. Exactly. Elena confirmed, leaning over the desk to point at the routing numbers. They register a fake vendor LLC in a state with strict corporate privacy laws. Then DeAndre or Vanessa's husband authorized massive recurring payments to these fake vendors for services that were never actually rendered. Fictitious supply chain audits, phantom marketing campaigns, non-existent legal consultations. The money flows out of Sterling Enterprises into these shell accounts, and then it is immediately transferred directly into their personal offshore trusts. The sheer audacity of the crime was absolutely staggering. They were not just making bad business deals. They were actively, intentionally bleeding their own family legacy dry. How much have they taken? I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Elena took a deep breath. Over the last 4 years, close to $12 million. They single-handedly drained the operating capital. That is why Richard had to start stealing from the employee pension fund. He was desperately trying to plug a massive hole in the ship, completely unaware that his own golden child daughter and favorite nephew were the ones drilling the holes in the hull. I flipped through the pages, examining the corresponding personal bank records my forensic team had managed to subpoena through our quiet channels. The evidence was damning and meticulously detailed. I saw the exact dates and the exact amounts. On November 12th, Vanessa's husband authorized a $500,000 payment to a fake consulting firm. 3 days later, Vanessa purchased a custom imported luxury sports car. On December 20th, DeAndre pushed through a massive invoice for a phantom logistics assessment. The very next morning, he paid the premium non-refundable upgrade fee for the St. Regis penthouse in Aspen. I looked at the receipts for their designer wardrobes, their exclusive country club memberships, and their lavish holiday parties. Every single diamond necklace, every bottle of vintage champagne, every arrogant smirk they wore like a badge of honor was entirely funded by stolen money. A harsh, cold laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly in the quiet office. The profound hypocrisy of my family was almost beautiful in its absolute darkness. I thought back to the Christmas dinner. I remembered Patricia leaning across the mahogany table, viciously mocking my supposed lack of ambition, demanding I use my fake secretary perks to get them room upgrades because they were the ones carrying the heavy burden of real success. I remembered Vanessa rolling her eyes at my vintage clothing. I remembered DeAndre cornering my husband in the kitchen, aggressively calling Nathan a financial parasite and belittling his honest, hard-earned salary. They had spent my entire life convincing the world that I was the embarrassing failure of the Sterling family. They demanded constant gratitude from me for allowing me to simply breathe their air. And the whole time they were nothing more than common thieves wearing expensive suits, desperately cannibalizing their own livelihood to maintain a pathetic illusion of superiority. Are we adding this to the regulatory file for Harrison Vance? Elena asked, carefully watching my reaction. I closed the heavy manila folder and rested my hands flat against the cool leather surface. No. We are keeping this separate. The state auditors can handle Richard and the pension fund. But this specific file belongs entirely to me. I stood up and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the city grid below. The traffic lights pulsed like slow, steady heartbeats. My family had always relied on my silence. They assumed my quiet demeanor was a symptom of weakness, a permanent surrender to their dominance. They had no idea that I had spent the last decade learning how to be the most dangerous person in any room. Make a dozen copies of this entire file, I instructed Elena without turning around. Put them in premium leather binders. I want every single fraudulent invoice, every fake vendor registration, and every corresponding luxury receipt highlighted and heavily tabbed for easy reading. Elena smiled, a sharp, knowing expression that perfectly matched my own. Preparing a little light reading for the board of directors. Something like that, I replied. The pieces were now perfectly arranged on the board. I held the mortgage to their headquarters. I controlled their logistics infrastructure. The federal government was preparing to indict Richard for pension fraud, and I possessed the undeniable proof that the rest of the family were nothing more than parasitic embezzlers. The Sterling family thought the Oakridge Country Club gala was going to be a celebration of their enduring legacy and wealth. They had absolutely no idea they were throwing themselves a magnificent, highly catered funeral. All that was left to do was put on my vintage emerald dress, attend the party, and light the match. Exactly 2 weeks before the fateful retirement gala at the Oakridge Country Club, my family insisted on gathering for our mandatory Sunday brunch. The venue was Le Petit Chateau, an exclusive French bistro in downtown Greenwich that required reservations 6 months in advance. The restaurant was a sea of white linen tablecloths, sparkling crystal, and the soft ambient hum of generational wealth. It was the perfect stage for the Sterling family to perform their favorite weekend play, pretending to be absolute royalty, while their actual kingdom was quietly burning to the ground. I had spent the last 48 hours reviewing the leather binders my forensic team had prepared. The undeniable proof of my family's massive embezzlement ring was currently locked inside a fireproof safe in my home office. I knew exactly how much DeAndre had stolen. I knew exactly which offshore accounts Vanessa was using to fund her lavish lifestyle. I knew that every single arrogant boast they were about to make across this brunch table was paid for with stolen money. I sat down next to Nathan, smoothing my simple wool skirt, feeling a strange, absolute calm wash over me. I was no longer the frightened outcast hoping for a crumb of validation. I was the executioner, simply enjoying a final meal with the condemned. At the head of the table, Richard was aggressively slicing into a thick piece of prime steak, loudly detailing the lavish final touches for his upcoming retirement party. Evelyn sat beside him, nodding along with practiced devotion, while Patricia complained to a deeply intimidated waiter about the temperature of her hollandaise sauce. Across from me, DeAndre and Brittany were completely absorbed in themselves. DeAndre was wearing a new custom-tailored Italian suit that I knew for a fact cost exactly $6,000. I knew the price because I had personally traced the fraudulent invoice from his shell company to the boutique tailor just 2 days prior. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his mimosa, and loudly steered the conversation back to his favorite topic, his own supposed brilliance. "I am telling you," Richard DeAndre announced, making sure his voice carried to the neighboring tables. "The logistics sector is entirely about aggressive expansion right now. The new vendors I brought on board this quarter have completely revolutionized our supply chain. We are moving freight at a pace this company has never seen before." Richard nodded approvingly, raising his glass. "You have done phenomenal work, DeAndre. The vendor transition has been seamless." You are showing exactly the kind of ruthless initiative Sterling Enterprises needs as I step down. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. It was almost too easy. They were practically begging me to test the waters. I placed my cup delicately on the porcelain saucer and leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. DeAndre. I said, my voice perfectly pleasant and genuinely curious. I have been reading a lot about the recent shifts in supply chain management. With the massive influx of new out-of-state vendors you brought on this quarter, I am incredibly curious how you are handling the new federal compliance protocols. The entire table paused. DeAndre stopped swirling his mimosa. He looked at me, a flicker of profound confusion crossing his face. What are you talking about, Cassidy? I offered him a bright, encouraging smile. Well, you know the standard due diligence updates. Are you using a secondary auditing firm to verify the corporate tax identifiers of these new vendors? Or are you running the beneficial ownership cross-checks internally? With so many new LLCs popping up, the risk of shell company fraud is at an all-time high. I was just wondering how your team manages the independent EIN verification to ensure the capital is actually reaching legitimate operations. The silence that fell over the brunch table was absolute and entirely suffocating. DeAndre did not just freeze, he practically stopped breathing. All the arrogant blood completely drained from his face, leaving him a sickly, terrifying shade of pale. His hand trembled slightly, causing a drop of his mimosa to spill onto the pristine white tablecloth. He opened his mouth, closed it, and then opened it again, resembling a fish suddenly pulled from the water. Well, DeAndre stammered, his voice dropping an octave as his eyes darted frantically around the room. We have Synergy. We use a highly agile workflow for all third-party onboarding. It is a highly proprietary system, Cassidy. You would not really grasp the complex metrics we utilize for vendor integration. He was throwing out meaningless corporate buzzwords in a desperate, panicked attempt to cover the massive, gaping hole in his knowledge. He knew exactly what I was asking. He knew that if anyone actually ran a beneficial ownership check on his new vendors, they would find his own name at the bottom of the money trail. I tilted my head, refusing to let him off the hook. But an agile workflow does not replace a federal tax audit, DeAndre. If the vendors are legitimate, providing a basic compliance certificate takes 5 minutes. Surely you have those on file for the board to review? DeAndre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. His panic instantly mutated into defensive, explosive anger. The sheer terror of being caught cornered him into a vicious corner. Why are you aggressively interrogating me about my department? DeAndre snapped, his voice cracking slightly. He slammed his glass down on the table. This is exactly what you always do, Cassidy. You read one stupid article on the internet and suddenly you think you are a corporate watchdog. You are just incredibly jealous of my success because you are stuck running a pathetic little hobby out of your spare bedroom. Before I could even respond to his ridiculous outburst, Aunt Patricia immediately jumped to her son's defense, her maternal instincts violently triggered. She pointed a heavy manicured finger directly at my face. "How dare you!" Cassidy Patricia hissed, her eyes wide with unhinged fury. "We are trying to enjoy a beautiful family Sunday, and you decide to launch an unprovoked attack on DeAndre's professional integrity. You sit there with absolutely zero real business experience and try to interrogate a vice president. You are an absolute embarrassment to this table." Richard threw his cloth napkin down in disgust, the sharp sound echoing like a gunshot. Patricia is entirely right. Cassidy, this constant, pathetic need for attention has to stop. You do not understand corporate finance. You do not understand compliance protocols or vendor acquisitions. You are tossing around big words you do not comprehend just to sound important. I will not have you disrespecting the senior management of my company. Apologize to DeAndre immediately. Evelyn reached across the table and grabbed my hand, squeezing it tightly enough to cause physical pain. Stop ruining this, Cassidy. Just tell him you are sorry and let the adults get back to their conversation. I looked around the table at all of them. Patricia was practically vibrating with rage. Richard was glaring at me with supreme authority. Evelyn was mortified by my supposed lack of manners, and DeAndre was sitting there, his chest heaving, hiding behind his mother and his uncle, desperately hoping they would silence me before I accidentally exposed his massive criminal enterprise. They were so incredibly blind. They were fighting viciously to protect a man who was actively robbing them and attacking the only person who actually understood the math. I looked at DeAndre. I saw the raw, unfiltered terror hiding just behind his angry eyes. He knew he was completely vulnerable. He knew his entire operation was a fragile house of cards, and my simple question had just sent a massive gust of wind right through his front door. I gently pulled my hand out of my mother's harsh grip. I let a slow, apologetic smile spread across my face, perfectly masking the absolute predator lurking just beneath the surface. "You are all entirely right," I said, my voice soft and deliberately submissive. "I apologize, DeAndre. I was out of line. I read an article in a business magazine the other day, and I guess I just wanted to sound like I understood what you do. I obviously have no idea how high-level vendor acquisitions actually work. Please forgive me." DeAndre let out a long, shaky breath, the tension leaving his shoulders in a massive wave of relief. He quickly adjusted his expensive tie, instantly rebuilding his shattered ego. "Just stick to what you know," DeAndre sneered, his arrogance rushing back to fill the void. "Leave the complex logistics and the heavy lifting to the professionals." "I will," I promised him, softly picking up my coffee cup once again. Nathan gave my knee a gentle squeeze under the table. He was the only one in the entire restaurant who saw the lethal trap I had just meticulously tested. I had dropped the subject, but I had gained absolutely everything I needed. DeAndre's panicked reaction confirmed that his fraudulent shell companies had zero defensive paperwork. He had built no safety nets. He was completely exposed, and he was terrified. As the brunch conversation shifted back to the expensive floral arrangements for the upcoming gala, I sat back and watched them eat their steak and drink their champagne. I smiled because I knew the absolute truth. The interrogation was completely over. The verdict was already sealed, and in just 2 short weeks, the execution would be entirely televised. Exactly 5 days before the retirement gala, the careful illusion I had maintained for years faced a direct physical invasion. Nathan and I lived in a modest 3-bedroom suburban house in Stamford, Connecticut. It was a perfectly pleasant, unassuming neighborhood filled with young families and sensible sedans. Of course, my family had absolutely no idea that this house was merely a strategic cover. They did not know about the massive gated estate Nathan and I were secretly building in the secluded hills of upstate New York, or the luxury penthouse we owned under a corporate trust in Manhattan. To the Sterlings, this Stamford address was the ultimate proof of my supposed mediocrity. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting at my kitchen island, finalizing the hostile debt acquisition of Sterling Enterprises on my laptop, when a loud, aggressive knock rattled my front door. I did not have time to check the security cameras before the door swung open. My Aunt Patricia marched right into my hallway, completely uninvited, carrying a large, opaque plastic garment bag from a discount department store. Patricia stood in my small entryway, her nose wrinkled in profound disgust, as if the very oxygen in my home was somehow beneath her standards. She ran a critical eye over my simple furniture and the modest artwork on the walls. "It always smells like cheap laundry detergent in here," Patricia announced, tossing her expensive leather handbag onto my kitchen counter without waiting for a greeting. "I do not understand how you tolerate living in this depressing little box, Cassidy. But I am not here to discuss your unfortunate real estate choices. I brought you something for Saturday night." I slowly closed my laptop, securing the Vanguard Acquisitions financial dashboard, and stood up. "I already have a dress for the gala, Aunt Patricia." Patricia let out a sharp, condescending laugh. "I am sure you do. And I am sure it is some tragic off-the-rack disaster you found at a thrift store. I am not taking any chances. Richard has invited the most elite members of Connecticut society, along with our top-tier corporate investors." This night is about projecting absolute perfection and unified family success. I will not have you wandering around the Oakridge Country Club looking like a displaced charity case. She unzipped the cheap plastic garment bag and pulled out the dress. It was genuinely the most hideous piece of clothing I had ever seen. It was a stiff, poorly constructed polyester gown in a sickly shade of mustard yellow. The seams were uneven, the fabric looked incredibly itchy, and it had a high, suffocating neckline that belonged in a different century. It was not just an ugly dress. It was a deliberate, calculated humiliation. I stared at the yellow monstrosity, my expression completely neutral. "You want me to wear that, I demand you wear it," Patricia corrected, holding the dress up against the harsh kitchen lighting. Brittany spent $5,000 on a custom-imported silk gown for this event. She is the wife of our vice president. She represents the vibrant, successful future of the Sterling legacy. You, on the other hand, represent the absolute background. I do not want you showing up in something that makes it look like you are trying too hard. I do not want you attempting to upstage Brittany or drawing any unnecessary attention to yourself. This dress is perfectly suitable for someone of your limited social standing. The utter cruelty of her logic was breathtaking. She did not just want me to look bad, she wanted to explicitly weaponize my appearance to elevate her daughter-in-law. She wanted me to serve as the ugly, pathetic contrast to Brittany's expensive, stolen glamour. I folded my arms across my chest. I am not wearing a mustard yellow polyester sack, Patricia. I will wear the vintage emerald dress I already selected. It is completely appropriate for a formal evening. Patricia slammed the dress down onto my kitchen island, her face turning a vibrant shade of furious red. "You will listen to me, Cassidy. You do not get to dictate the terms of your presence in this family. If you do not wear this exact dress on Saturday night, you will not be allowed inside the venue. I will personally instruct Richard's private security team to physically bar you from entering the ballroom. You will be completely banned from the event, and you will be cut off from this family permanently. Do you understand me?" She thought she was holding the ultimate trump card. She thought the threat of missing the gala would crush me into total submission. What Patricia did not realize was that I absolutely needed to be inside that ballroom. I needed to be standing right in the center of the Oakridge Country Club when the federal agents breached the doors. I needed to look Richard directly in the eyes when his entire empire collapsed. I could not risk a pointless argument over a dress jeopardizing a 10-year strategy of total financial vengeance. I looked at the hideous yellow fabric, and then I looked at Patricia's triumphant, arrogant face. I let a perfectly crafted look of defeated resignation wash over my features. "Fine," I said, my voice quiet and seemingly broken. "Leave the dress. I will wear it." Patricia smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of her lips. "I knew you would eventually see reason. Just make sure you stay near the back tables on Saturday. Let the important people enjoy the spotlight." Before I could politely ask her to leave my home, the sound of heavy tires crunching on my driveway interrupted us. A massive luxury SUV pulled aggressively onto my front lawn, crushing a small bed of tulips near the mailbox. The driver's side door swung open, and Brittany stepped out, holding a massive designer coffee cup and looking incredibly annoyed. She pushed through the front door, barely acknowledging my existence. "The traffic on the interstate is an absolute nightmare," Brittany complained loudly to Patricia, kicking off her expensive heels directly onto my clean rug. "And finding this depressing little neighborhood took me an extra 20 minutes. My navigation system barely even recognizes this zip code." Brittany finally looked at me, offering a fake, highly strained smile. "Hi, Cass. I really need to use your bathroom." That iced latte went right through me. "The guest bathroom is down the hall to the left," I told her, pointing toward the small corridor off the living room. Brittany waved her hand dismissively and immediately started walking toward the carpeted stairs leading to the second floor. "Oh, I hate guest bathrooms. They always have cheap toilet paper. I am just going to use the one in your master bedroom." Before I could protest, she was already marching up the stairs, completely invading my private space with her usual staggering entitlement. I stood in the kitchen with Patricia, who was busy reapplying her expensive lipstick using the reflection of my microwave door. I tried to focus on my breathing, reminding myself that in just 5 days, these people would be facing federal indictments and total bankruptcy. But then I heard the distinct creak of the floorboards directly above my head. The footsteps were not walking toward the master bathroom. They were moving deliberately toward my large vanity mirror on the far side of the bedroom. "Excuse me for a moment," I said to Patricia, my voice dropping its submissive tone entirely. I turned and walked quickly up the stairs, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. When I reached the doorway of my master bedroom, my blood ran absolutely cold. Brittany was not in the bathroom. She was standing directly in front of my vanity, having completely rummaged through my personal belongings. In her hands, she held a dark blue velvet jewelry box, and the box was wide open. Inside the box rested a breathtaking, flawless diamond necklace set in pure platinum. It was an anniversary gift Nathan had quietly purchased for me 2 months prior. The necklace was an exclusive custom piece worth well over $100,000, paid for entirely by his legitimate massive engineering salary and our private investments. It was a piece of jewelry that eclipsed anything the Sterling family had ever owned. Brittany was holding the necklace up to the light, her eyes wide with greedy fascination. She looked at me standing in the doorway, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just been caught violently snooping through my private bedroom. "This is a really incredible fake cast," Brittany said casually, running her fingers over the flawless, brilliant cut stones. "I mean, whoever made this cubic zirconia really outdid themselves. The platinum plating actually looks heavy. Where did you even find something like this? A pawn shop?" She did not wait for an answer. With smooth, absolute arrogance, Brittany unclasped the heavy diamond necklace and secured it around her own neck. She turned back to my vanity mirror, admiring the way the priceless jewels caught the afternoon sunlight against her skin. "You know what?" Brittany decided, turning to face me with a bright, demanding smile. "This actually perfectly matches the $5,000 silk gown I am wearing on Saturday. It gives it that perfect vintage old money aesthetic. I am going to borrow this for the gala. You obviously do not need it anyway, especially since Patricia is making you wear that awful yellow polyester thing downstairs. It would just look ridiculous on you." She grabbed her designer purse and started walking toward the bedroom door, fully intending to simply walk out of my house with $100,000 of real diamonds wrapped around her throat. She took 2 steps before I moved. I stepped squarely into the center of the doorframe, planting my feet firmly onto the carpet. I crossed my arms, completely blocking her exit. My face was a mask of cold, unyielding stone. "Take it off, Brittany," I said. My voice was not loud, but it carried a sharp, terrifying authority that instantly froze the air in the room. "Take it off right now." Brittany stopped, letting out a short, highly exasperated laugh. "Oh, relax, Cassidy. I told you I am just borrowing it. I will give it back to you next week. It is just a piece of cheap glass. Stop being so dramatic." I did not move a single inch. I maintained unbroken, intense eye contact. "I am not going to ask you a second time. Take my necklace off, put it back in the velvet box, and step away from my vanity." Brittany's fake amusement vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly flare of pure entitlement. She stepped closer to me, trying to use her physical presence to intimidate me into moving. "Are you seriously trying to physically threaten me right now over a piece of fake jewelry? Move out of the doorway, Cassidy. You are acting completely insane." She reached her hand out, attempting to physically shove my shoulder and push past me into the hallway. The moment her hand made contact with my arm, I slapped her wrist away with a sharp, forceful strike. The loud smack echoed loudly in the quiet bedroom. Brittany gasped, stumbling backward in absolute shock. She clutched her wrist, staring at me as if I had just transformed into a terrifying monster right in front of her eyes. "I said take it off," I repeated, stepping slowly toward her, forcing her to back up until the back of her knees hit the edge of my mattress. For the first time in her pampered, stolen life, Brittany looked genuinely terrified. Her hands shook violently as she reached behind her neck, frantically fumbling with the heavy platinum clasp. She finally managed to undo it, practically throwing the priceless necklace onto my bedspread. "You are completely psychotic," Brittany screamed, her voice breaking into a hysterical, high-pitched wail. She grabbed her purse and pushed past me, sprinting out of the bedroom and thundering down the carpeted stairs. I followed her at a calm, measured pace. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, Patricia was already rushing out of the kitchen, her face a mask of frantic concern. Brittany threw herself into Patricia's arms, forcing heavy, dramatic sobs. "She attacked me!" Brittany cried, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. "I went upstairs to use the bathroom, and I just asked to borrow a cheap fake necklace for the party. She completely lost her mind and physically hit me. She is a violent lunatic." Patricia wrapped her arms protectively around her daughter-in-law, turning her furious, unhinged glare onto me. "You are a profoundly sick, deeply selfish woman, Cassidy." Patricia screamed, her voice echoing off my living room walls. "You are so consumed by your own bitter jealousy that you cannot even share a cheap, worthless trinket with your own family. You are an absolute loser, and you will always be a loser." Patricia grabbed the mustard yellow dress off the kitchen island and aggressively shoved it into my chest. "Wear the dress on Saturday, stay in the back, and do not you dare speak to Brittany ever again." I stood perfectly still, letting the cheap plastic bag fall to the floor at my feet. I watched in total silence as Patricia led a sobbing, highly victimized Brittany out my front door, slamming it shut behind them with enough force to rattle the window frames. The house plunged into a sudden deep silence. I was standing completely alone in my hallway. I slowly walked back up the stairs, entered my bedroom, and picked up the heavy diamond necklace from the bedspread. I held the flawless stones in my hand, feeling the genuine heavy weight of absolute reality. They had just called me a violent loser over a piece of jewelry they believed was worthless glass, entirely unaware that the woman they were insulting held enough power to buy and sell their entire miserable lives 100 times over. I carefully placed the diamonds back into the dark blue velvet box and locked it inside my safe. The dress ultimatum and the theft attempt had completely sealed their fate. They wanted a show on Saturday night, and I was going to give them a performance they would never, ever forget. Saturday night arrived with a crisp, biting chill in the air, but inside the black luxury town car Nathan had quietly hired for the evening, the atmosphere was perfectly calm. I looked out the tinted window as we drove up the winding, manicured driveway of the Oakridge Country Club. The sprawling estate was illuminated by massive floodlights projecting an image of untouchable historical wealth. Valets in crisp white uniforms rushed to open the doors of imported sports cars and heavy luxury sedans. For 3 decades, pulling up to this building had filled me with a deep, suffocating sense of dread. It was the arena where my family publicly paraded their supposed superiority, and where I was expected to play the role of the grateful, invisible peasant. But tonight, I felt absolutely no fear. Tonight, I was bringing the entire arena down to the ground. The valet opened my door, and I stepped out onto the pristine cobblestone driveway. I was not wearing the hideous mustard-yellow polyester sack my Aunt Patricia had aggressively thrown at my chest 5 days prior. That cheap piece of fabric was currently sitting at the bottom of a donation bin on the other side of town. Instead, I was wearing a breathtaking custom-tailored vintage emerald silk gown. I had purchased it at an exclusive private auction in Paris 2 years ago. The heavy, luxurious fabric draped flawlessly across my shoulders and cascaded to the floor, catching the ambient light and shimmering like dark water. But the dress was only the secondary statement. Resting securely against my collarbone was the flawless, brilliant cut platinum and diamond necklace Nathan had given me. The same necklace Brittany had desperately tried to steal from my bedroom vanity. Under the bright lights of the country club entrance, the genuine diamonds cast scattered prisms of pure blinding light. I did not look like the struggling, pathetic secretary my family desperately wanted me to be. I looked exactly like the self-made billionaire I actually was. Nathan stepped out beside me wearing a perfectly fitted classic black tuxedo that made him look like a cinematic leading man. He offered me his arm with a warm, knowing smile. "Are you ready for this?" he asked quietly. I linked my arm through his, feeling the solid, comforting strength of his presence. "I have been ready for this my entire life," I replied. We walked through the heavy glass double doors and stepped into the grand lobby of the country club. The space was a massive, echoing chamber of white marble crystal chandeliers and towering floral arrangements. Hundreds of Connecticut's absolute elite were mingling in the lobby, sipping early cocktails and waiting for the main ballroom doors to open. The dull roar of polite high society chatter filled the air. As Nathan and I walked past the coat check, something remarkable happened. The conversation in our immediate vicinity began to quietly taper off. Heads turned, eyes widened in genuine surprise. The wealthy investors and socialites who usually looked right through me suddenly stopped and stared. I carried myself with a new unshakable posture. I was not shrinking my shoulders to appear smaller. I was walking with the quiet, lethal authority of a woman who completely owned the ground she stood on. It did not take long for the massive shift in the room's attention to alert my family. From across the lobby, standing near a towering ice sculpture, my mother Evelyn and my aunt Patricia spotted me. I watched their expressions transition in real time from casual arrogance to utter confusion, and finally, to absolute unhinged fury. Patricia practically shoved an elderly investor out of her way as she marched across the marble floor toward us, her heavy heels clicking aggressively. Evelyn followed closely behind her, looking completely mortified by the sudden attention I was commanding. Standing a few paces back was Brittany. She was wearing her $5,000 custom silk gown, but standing in the same room as my emerald dress and the blinding diamonds around my neck, she suddenly looked entirely washed out and incredibly cheap. Brittany stared at the necklace, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure jealousy and rage. Patricia intercepted us just before we reached the entrance to the main ballroom, stepping directly into my path and forcing me to stop. She leaned in close, her heavily perfumed scent overwhelming, and spoke in a venomous, frantic hiss, designed to stay just below the radar of the other guests. "What in the absolute world do you think you are doing?" Patricia demanded, her eyes darting wildly over my dress and the jewelry. "I gave you explicit direct instructions on what to wear tonight." "Where is the dress I brought you?" I offered her a polite, completely empty smile. "I am afraid it got lost in the wash, Aunt Patricia. Polyester can be so unpredictable." Patricia's face turned a violent shade of crimson. "Do not play stupid with me, Cassidy. You think you are so clever, do you not? You think you can waltz in here and publicly disrespect me?" She aggressively pointed a trembling finger at my chest, being careful not to actually touch the diamonds. "I know exactly what you did," Patricia sneered, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You went to some pathetic rental boutique. You maxed out whatever miserable little credit cards you have to rent a designer gown and a piece of heavy glass jewelry. You drove yourself into massive debt just to come here and try to upstage Brittany. You are so consumed by petty jealousy that you are willing to bankrupt yourself just to pretend you belong in our world for one single night. It is honestly the most pathetic thing I have ever witnessed." Evelyn stepped forward, grabbing my arm with the same painful, controlling grip she had used my entire childhood. "Cassidy, this is a massive embarrassment." My mother hissed, her eyes wide with panic as she noticed a few nearby investors watching our tense exchange. "You look completely ridiculous trying to impersonate a woman of wealth. You are making a mockery of your father's retirement. I want you to turn around, walk out those front doors, and go home right now." I looked down at my mother's hand on my arm, and then I looked directly into her frantic eyes. "I am not going anywhere, Mother. I was invited to this gala, and I intend to stay for the entire show." Evelyn gasped, completely taken aback by my flat refusal. "If you do not leave this building immediately," she threatened, her voice shaking with absolute authority, "Richard and I will call our lawyers first thing on Monday morning. We will officially and legally remove your name from the Sterling Family Trust. We will cut you out of the will entirely. You will not see a single dime of our money for the rest of your miserable life. Do you understand the massive mistake you are making? For my entire life, the threat of the Sterling family will had been the ultimate leash. It was the weapon they used to enforce my compliance." The financial guillotine they constantly held over my head to ensure I never spoke back, never demanded respect, and never stepped out of my designated place in the dirt. They genuinely believed their money was the center of my universe. They had absolutely no idea that their precious family trust was currently bleeding out from the inside, drained by their own golden children, and that I already owned the massive debts they could not pay. I did not pull my arm away. I simply stood there in my vintage emerald gown, wearing diamonds that cost more than their remaining liquid assets, and I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound of my amusement completely shattered their arrogant posturing. Patricia recoiled as if I had just slapped her across the face. Evelyn loosened her grip, staring at me as if I were a complete stranger. "I do not need your money, Mom," I said, my voice incredibly calm, clear, and perfectly steady. The words hung in the air between us, heavy and absolute. Evelyn's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. She had no defense against a total lack of fear. Patricia, however, completely lost her remaining composure. "You are a delusional, arrogant, ungrateful brat." Patricia spat, her voice rising slightly above an acceptable whisper, drawing even more stares from the surrounding elite crowd. "You are nothing without this family, Cassidy. You will always be nothing." Before she could launch into another unhinged tirade, the heavy oak doors of the main ballroom swung open with a grand, sweeping gesture. A unified chord from the string quartet spilled out into the lobby, signaling that the main event was officially beginning. The crowd of wealthy guests immediately began to shift and flow toward the glowing crystal-lit room. I gently removed my mother's hand from my arm and smoothed the silk of my dress. "If you will excuse me," I said, maintaining perfect icy eye contact with both of them. "I believe it is time to find our seats. I understand Richard has prepared a very special speech for us tonight. I would absolutely hate to miss a single word of it." I turned away from their shocked, furious faces, took Nathan's arm once again, and walked gracefully into the massive ballroom. I glided past the head tables, entirely ignoring DeAndre's confused glare and Vanessa's open-mouthed stare, and made my way toward the back of the room. I picked up a delicate crystal champagne flute from a passing waiter's tray and took my designated place in the shadows. I stood perfectly still, waiting for Richard to take the stage, fully prepared to let him deliver the arrogant punchline that would ultimately serve as his own spectacular funeral dirge. Before Richard took the stage for his grand retirement speech, there was the mandatory hour of aggressive high society networking. The Oakridge Country Club ballroom was a masterpiece of classic opulence. Towering centerpieces of white orchids and imported roses sat on every table. A 12-piece string quartet played soft classical music in the corner, entirely drowned out by the heavy hum of hundreds of wealthy guests clinking champagne flutes and trading corporate gossip. Nathan and I had claimed a small, quiet, high-top table near the back bar, observing the room with the clinical detachment of scientists watching a highly predictable social experiment. From our vantage point, I had a perfect view of the entire Sterling family operating in their natural habitat. At the absolute center of the room, standing directly beneath the largest crystal chandelier, was Richard. He was holding court in a tight, exclusive circle with the primary board of directors for Sterling Enterprises. These were the men who controlled the massive institutional wealth backing the company. I recognized Arthur Pendleton, the elderly chairman of the board, holding a glass of scotch and nodding slowly at whatever lie Richard was currently spinning. Standing right beside Richard, practically vibrating with artificial importance, were DeAndre and Brittany. DeAndre was gesturing wildly with his free hand, aggressively pitching his supposed logistics triumph to the captive audience of billionaires. Brittany stood close to his side, offering practiced, perfectly white smiles to the board members. However, every few seconds, her eyes would frantically dart across the room, searching for me in the crowd. When she finally spotted my vintage emerald gown and the heavy diamond necklace resting against my collarbone, her fake smile faltered, replaced by a dark, simmering glare of pure resentment. Her $5,000 custom dress looked incredibly stiff and uninspired under the harsh ballroom lighting. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water and turned to Nathan. I think it is time I go pay my respects to the board of directors, I said, setting my glass down on the high-top table. Nathan smiled a quiet, completely supportive expression. Give them my absolute best, he replied, leaning back against the mahogany bar. I navigated through the dense crowd of socialites and regional executives, moving with a calm, unhurried grace. The heavy silk of my dress flowed smoothly around my legs, and the subtle, blinding flashes of my diamond necklace continued to draw quiet stares and hushed whispers from the surrounding guests. I did not break my stride. I walked with absolute purpose, directly toward the center of the room, targeting the impenetrable circle Richard had formed with the board of directors. As I approached the group, Richard was in the middle of a highly animated sentence. And that is exactly why the transition of power is happening tonight. Arthur? Richard boasted, his chest puffed out with maximum arrogance. We need fresh, aggressive blood to carry Sterling Enterprises into the next decade. Richard placed a heavy paternal hand on DeAndre's shoulder, pulling his nephew forward into the spotlight. DeAndre here has completely revolutionized our supply chain in just one fiscal quarter. He secured the $1 million Apex Logistics contract and completely optimized our entire vendor network. He is the future of this company. DeAndre and Brittany are the dynamic leadership team that will ensure your investments continue to yield maximum dividends. Arthur Pendleton offered a slow, approving nod, raising his Scotch glass in a slight toast to DeAndre. Excellent work, son. We appreciate aggressive expansion. It was at that exact moment I stepped into their peripheral vision. Good evening, Richard. I said, my voice clear, melodic, and perfectly calibrated to cut through the heavy masculine posturing of the circle. Hello, Arthur. It is wonderful to see you all tonight. Richard's head snapped toward me, and his entire demeanor shifted instantly from jovial corporate titan to aggressive territorial gatekeeper. He saw the way Arthur and the other board members were looking at me, their eyes drawn to the undeniable expensive elegance of my attire. He saw the silent question forming in their minds about who this incredibly composed woman was. Before Arthur could even open his mouth to return my greeting, Richard moved. He took a wide, deliberate step directly in front of me, using his large physical frame to completely block my access to the board members. He turned his back slightly toward me, physically boxing me out of the inner circle and forcing me to stand on the absolute periphery like an uninvited stranger. Oh, excuse the interruption, gentlemen, Richard said smoothly, offering the board members a highly dismissive, apologetic chuckle. He gestured over his shoulder at me with a lazy flick of his wrist. This is my other daughter, Cassidy. She is not exactly part of the executive strategy team. Arthur looked at me, a polite but slightly confused expression on his lined face. Oh, I see. What department do you handle for the company, Cassidy? Before I could utter a single syllable, Richard answered for me, his voice dripping with heavy, unmistakable condescension. Cassidy does not work in corporate finance, Arthur. She is not exactly business-minded. She runs a little hobby project on the internet and files basic paperwork for a living. She is mostly here tonight to enjoy the free catering and take a break from her clerical duties. Is that not right, sweetie? Richard turned his head just enough to look at me over his shoulder. His eyes were hard-filled with a vicious, silent warning. He was commanding me to play my designated role. He was ordering me to nod, smile meekly, and walk away so he could continue selling his fraudulent empire to the men holding the purse strings. DeAndre let out a short, highly mocking laugh, emboldened by Richard's aggressive physical block. Do not worry about the complex logistics talk, Cass DeAndre chimed in, leaning around Richard to deliver his insult. We promise not to bore you with anything that does not involve alphabetizing file cabinets. The board members offered a chorus of polite, highly condescending smiles. They were older men of a specific generation who comfortably accepted Richard's assessment without a second thought. To them, I had instantly been reduced from a striking, elegant woman to a pathetic, slow-witted family liability who needed to be politely ignored. I stood there behind Richard's broad shoulders, feeling the intense, suffocating weight of their collective dismissal. 10 years ago, this exact scenario would have completely destroyed me. I would have felt the burning sting of tears in my eyes, turned on my heel, and hid in the ladies' restroom for the rest of the evening. I would have believed every single word Richard said about my lack of worth. But tonight, their absolute ignorance was the most beautiful thing I had ever witnessed. They were actively mocking the only person in the entire room who held the literal mortgage to the building they were standing in. They were laughing at the woman who possessed a heavily tabbed leather binder proving every single word out of DeAndre's mouth was a federal crime. I did not shrink away. I did not break eye contact with Arthur Pendleton, completely ignoring Richard's massive blocking presence. "Richard is absolutely right, Arthur," I said, my voice projecting clearly over Richard's shoulder. "I do spend a massive amount of my time filing paperwork and reviewing basic documentation. In fact, I have spent the last several weeks reviewing a very specific, highly detailed set of financial files." Richard stiffened immediately, his aggressive posture faltering for a fraction of a second. DeAndre's mocking smile completely vanished, replaced by a sudden nervous twitch in his jaw. They both remembered the brunch interrogation. They knew exactly what kind of paperwork I was capable of reading. Arthur raised an eyebrow, mildly amused by my persistence. "Oh, and what kind of files are those, my dear? Just basic ledgers?" I replied with a bright, entirely pleasant smile that did not reach my eyes. "Vendor contracts, offshore routing numbers, beneficial ownership certificates. You know, the boring clerical details that people usually ignore until a structural audit completely collapses the entire foundation of a company." But Richard is right. I should leave the aggressive expansion to the professionals. Enjoy your evening, gentlemen. I offered a polite nod, turned gracefully on my heel, and walked away from the inner circle. I did not look back, but I did not need to. I could practically feel the sudden icy tension radiating from Richard and DeAndre. I had just planted a massive, highly specific seed of doubt directly in the minds of the primary investors, right in front of their faces. I walked back to the high-top table where Nathan was waiting. He handed me my glass of sparkling water. "How are the titans of industry doing tonight?" he asked, his eyes dancing with quiet amusement. I took a slow sip, enjoying the cool, crisp taste. "They are doing absolutely fantastic," I told him, looking across the room to see Richard desperately trying to regain Arthur's full attention. "But I think they are going to find the upcoming retirement speech incredibly educational." The string quartet suddenly stopped playing. A loud, sharp chime echoed through the ballroom speakers, signaling the end of the cocktail hour. The crowd began to murmur and shift, taking their assigned seats at the massive crystal-laden tables. The show was finally starting. It was time for Richard to take the stage and deliver the speech that would trigger the absolute total destruction of his world. As the sharp chime faded into the ambient noise of the ballroom, the massive crowd began a slow, synchronized migration toward the dining area. The transition from cocktail hour to the seated dinner was a highly choreographed display of social hierarchy. The tables were arranged in a strict order of importance. At the very front of the room, positioned directly below the stage, was table 1. It was draped in silver silk overflowing with imported white orchids and reserved exclusively for Richard Evelyn, the board of directors, and the supposed future of the company, DeAndre and Brittany. Nathan and I naturally were assigned to table 48. It was located at the absolute back of the ballroom, positioned dangerously close to the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. The floral centerpiece on our table was noticeably smaller, and the lighting was slightly dimmer. My Aunt Patricia had clearly overseen the seating chart, ensuring that my vintage emerald dress and blinding diamond necklace were kept as far away from the main cameras as possible. We navigated through the maze of chairs and seated ourselves. The people assigned to our table were low-level regional managers and distant cousins who barely made eye contact with us, terrified that acknowledging the family outcast might negatively impact their own fragile social standing. I smoothed my silk skirt over my knees and offered Nathan a quiet, knowing smile. He reached across the table and briefly squeezed my hand, perfectly content to sit in the shadows with me and wait for the inevitable explosion. Before the first course could even be served, the room was still buzzing with guests settling into their seats. Arthur Pendleton and two other senior board members were slowly making their way toward table 1, deep in conversation. DeAndre, acting as the self-appointed master of ceremonies, was escorting them through the crowded floor. He was walking slightly ahead of the billionaires, his chest puffed out, pointing out the various lavish details of the ballroom as if he had personally funded the entire event. Their path to the front of the room required them to walk down the main center aisle, bringing them directly past our table near the back. As DeAndre approached, I could see the exact moment his fragile, desperately insecure ego took control. He saw me sitting quietly at table 48. He saw the senior executives walking right behind him, and he simply could not resist the overwhelming urge to publicly assert his dominance one more time. He needed to prove to Arthur that the brief, uncomfortable exchange during the cocktail hour was just a fluke, and that he was still the undisputed apex predator of the Sterling family. DeAndre suddenly stopped walking, causing Arthur and the other board members to pause behind him. He turned toward our table, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. He reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored $6,000 suit and pulled out a thick, expensive leather wallet. "Hey, Cass," DeAndre called out, his voice practically booming over the low hum of the ballroom. He made absolutely sure that Arthur and the other executives were watching him. "I know Richard mentioned you are just here for the free catering tonight, but I wanted to make sure you and Nathan are fully taken care of." The conversation at our table stopped immediately. The regional managers stared down at their empty plates, holding their breath. I remained perfectly still, resting my hands comfortably on the table, and looked up at him. DeAndre flipped open his wallet and dramatically pulled out a crisp $20 bill. He held it up under the dim lighting, waving it slightly so the men behind him could see it. "I know things are probably pretty tight for you guys right now." DeAndre continued, his tone dripping with weaponized pity. "And the valet parking at a luxury country club like this probably costs more than you make in an entire week filing paperwork. I would absolutely hate for your little 5-year-old sedan to get towed because you cannot afford the tip. So here, take this. Go ahead and get your car back later on me. Consider it a charitable donation from the new executive team." He stepped forward and casually tossed the $20 bill onto the center of my plate. It landed with a soft flutter against the pristine white porcelain. A few of the distant cousins at our table let out awkward, highly uncomfortable chuckles, desperate to appease him. Brittany, who had wandered over to join her husband, let out a loud, theatrical sigh of admiration, wrapping her arm around DeAndre's waist. "You are always so incredibly generous, babe," she said, her eyes locked onto my diamond necklace with burning, undisguised hatred. Arthur Pendleton offered a tight, polite smile, clearly eager to move past the awkward family dynamic and get to his seat. But DeAndre was reveling in the moment. He stood there practically vibrating with arrogant satisfaction, waiting for me to lower my head in absolute humiliation. He wanted me to slide the bill into my purse and quietly thank him for his scraps. I did not touch the money. I did not break eye contact with him. I simply sat back in my chair, the heavy platinum clasp of my necklace resting perfectly against my skin. The sheer absurdity of the moment was genuinely intoxicating. Here was a man who had stolen millions of dollars from his own family, a man whose entire existence was funded by fake vendor invoices and offshore shell accounts, trying to humiliate me with a $20 bill while I secretly held the mortgage to his entire life. "DeAndre," I said, my voice completely devoid of anger or embarrassment. It was perfectly calm, smooth, and laced with an icy, terrifying certainty. "I deeply appreciate your profound concern for my financial well-being." I slowly reached out, picked up the crisp $20 bill by the very edge, and held it up to the light. I inspected it for a brief moment before gently placing it right back into DeAndre's outstretched hand. I folded his fingers over the money, my touch surprisingly firm. But you should really keep this, I told him, holding his gaze with absolute authority. You are going to need every single dollar you can find very soon. DeAndre's confident smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Excuse me, he scoffed, trying to laugh off my response, but the sound was completely hollow. You would be incredibly surprised by what I actually own. DeAndre? I continued, my voice dropping to a register that only he and the people immediately surrounding us could hear. For instance, I own my car. I own my home. I own my entire future. I do not have to rely on creative accounting or highly agile vendor workflows to pay for my dinner. I leaned forward slightly, closing the distance between us. You should spend significantly less time worrying about my valet tip and focus entirely on your own balances, because when the audit finally reaches the bottom of the ledger, a $20 bill is not going to cover your legal fees. The effect was immediate and absolutely devastating. The arrogant, untouchable facade DeAndre had carefully constructed for the board members shattered into a million invisible pieces. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His eyes widened in sheer unadulterated panic. He remembered the brunch at the French bistro. He remembered my highly specific questions about beneficial ownership certificates and federal compliance protocols. And looking into my eyes right now, he suddenly realized I was not guessing. I knew absolutely everything. He tried to speak, to hurl another loud insult to regain his footing, but his throat seized up completely. His hand, still clutching the crumpled $20 bill, began to shake violently. Is everything all right here, DeAndre? Arthur Pendleton asked, stepping forward with a look of mild concern. The elderly chairman had noticed the sudden drastic shift in DeAndre's demeanor. DeAndre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. He shoved the money back into his pocket with a jerky, uncoordinated movement. Yes, fine, everything is perfectly fine, Arthur, he stammered, his voice thin and incredibly weak. Just catching up with my cousin. We should get to our seats. The first course is about to arrive. Without another word to me, DeAndre spun around and practically sprinted toward the front of the ballroom, leaving Brittany standing there looking deeply confused. She glared at me one last time before hurrying after her husband, her $5,000 dress swishing angrily behind her. I watched them retreat to the safety of Table 1, taking their seats next to Richard and Evelyn. DeAndre immediately reached for his water glass, his hand trembling so badly the ice clinked loudly against the crystal rim. He did not look back in my direction. The seed of total panic I had planted during the cocktail hour had just blossomed into absolute terror. Nathan leaned over, picking up his linen napkin and placing it neatly on his lap. That was remarkably efficient, he observed quietly. I picked up my salad fork, feeling a deep, highly satisfying sense of peace wash over me. The appetizers have been wonderful tonight, I agreed, turning my attention to the empty stage at the front of the room. But I am genuinely starving for the main course. The heavy velvet curtains behind the stage parted, and a single spotlight illuminated the wooden podium. The low hum of conversation in the ballroom immediately died down as a sharp tap on the microphone echoed through the space. Richard stepped up to the podium, adjusting his expensive tie and offering his brightest, most artificial smile to the crowd of wealthy investors. The moment had finally arrived. Richard tapped the microphone twice. A sharp, brief sound of feedback rang through the massive Oakridge Country Club ballroom, immediately silencing the low hum of hundreds of wealthy guests. The warm, ambient lighting of the room dimmed slightly, and a bright, focused spotlight illuminated the wooden podium. Richard stood at the absolute center of the stage, gripping the edges of the podium with a practiced, authoritative posture. He looked out over the sea of faces, his chest puffed out, radiating the false confidence of a man who believed he had successfully outsmarted the entire world. Thank you, Richard, began, his voice projecting smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system. Thank you all for being here tonight. Looking out at this incredible gathering of friends, family, and esteemed colleagues, I am profoundly reminded of what it takes to build a lasting legacy. 30 years ago, Sterling Enterprises was just a vision. Today, it is an undeniable pillar of the Connecticut financial community. A wave of polite synchronized applause rolled through the ballroom. At table one, directly beneath the stage, Evelyn beamed with absolute devotion. Aunt Patricia clapped enthusiastically, while DeAndre stared blankly at his water glass, the sheer terror from our earlier interactions still paralyzing him. But true leadership is not just about building an empire. Richard continued, raising a hand to quiet the applause. It is about knowing exactly when to pass the torch and exactly who to pass it to. As you all know, we have recently implemented some highly aggressive expansion strategies. We brought in new dynamic leadership. He gestured grandly toward DeAndre and Brittany. We streamlined our logistics, optimized our operational capital, and caught the attention of the absolute heavyweights in the industry. Richard paused, leaning closer to the microphone. He lowered his voice to a conspiratorial, highly self-satisfied tone. In fact, I am incredibly proud to officially announce tonight that Sterling Enterprises has entered into a massive, highly lucrative acquisition phase with Vanguard Acquisitions. A loud murmur of genuine surprise and impressed chatter swept through the crowd of investors. Vanguard Acquisitions was a terrifyingly powerful, highly secretive corporate restructuring firm. In the financial world, Vanguard was known as an apex predator. They bought struggling companies, completely gutted their inefficient management, and turned massive profits. But Richard, in his infinite blinding arrogance, had completely misunderstood their hostile takeover. He was spinning his total defeat as a brilliant strategic merger. The executives at Vanguard are brilliant, Richard boasted, a smug, completely oblivious smile spreading across his face. They looked at our books, they saw the incredible value we built, and they knew they had to partner with us. They recognized our elite market position. It just goes to show you that when you operate at the highest possible level, the world absolutely notices. I sat at table 48, resting my chin on my hand, completely fascinated by the sheer magnitude of his delusion. He was standing in front of 200 people bragging about a corporate buyout that was actually a hostile foreclosure engineered entirely by the daughter he had just banished to the back of the room. And that brings me to my final point tonight. Richard said, his eyes scanning the back of the ballroom until they locked directly onto my table. He could not resist. He simply had to take one final public swing at his favorite punching bag to elevate himself. In business, just like in family, there is a natural, undeniable hierarchy. Richard announced, his voice taking on a sharp, mocking edge. It is a hard truth, but an important one. Some people possess the vision, the drive, and the sheer intellect to shape the world. And some people, well, some people are meant to lead, and some are simply meant to follow. The crowd erupted into a chorus of knowing chuckles. It was a classic, arrogant corporate joke, perfectly delivered. At table one, Brittany turned around in her seat, found my face in the dim lighting, and offered a highly visible, incredibly vicious smirk. She thought this was my ultimate public humiliation. She thought I was finally being put in my exact pathetic place. I did not react. I simply took a slow breath, waiting for my moment. But before I could even shift my weight to stand up and deliver the counterattack I had planned, Nathan moved. My husband, the man who had quietly supported me through a decade of emotional abuse, the man who preferred to observe from the shadows and let me fight my own battles, had finally reached his absolute limit. Nathan calmly placed his linen napkin onto the table. He did not say a word to me. He simply stood up. The regional managers sitting at our table gasped softly, shrinking back into their chairs as Nathan stepped out from the shadows. His face was a mask of cold, terrifying calm. He did not look angry. He looked completely, utterly unshakable. Nathan began walking down the long center aisle of the ballroom. His footsteps were silent against the thick carpet, but his physical presence commanded immediate, undeniable attention. The guests sitting at the back tables stopped talking. As he moved past the middle section of the room, the chuckles completely died away. A strange, heavy silence began to ripple through the Oakridge Country Club. "What is he doing?" I heard Aunt Patricia hiss loudly from table 1 as Nathan approached the front of the room. Evelyn reached out, her face pale with sudden panic. Nathan completely ignored them. He bypassed table 1 without a single glance. He walked directly up the 4 carpeted steps leading onto the main stage. Richard stopped smiling. His arrogant posture instantly vanished, replaced by deep, highly aggressive confusion. He stepped away from the podium, holding his hand up as if to physically halt Nathan's progress. "Nathan, what do you think you are doing?" Richard demanded, his voice carrying, without the microphone in the suddenly silent room. "Sit down immediately. This is not the time for your inappropriate behavior." Nathan did not stop. He walked right up to Richard, closing the distance until they were standing chest to chest. Richard was a tall, imposing man who used his physical size to intimidate his employees, but standing next to Nathan, he suddenly looked incredibly small and fragile. Nathan did not raise his hands. He did not yell. He simply reached out, bypassed Richard entirely, and firmly gripped the microphone. Richard opened his mouth to shout for security, but Nathan offered him a single freezing look that instantly paralyzed the older man. It was the look of a structural engineer staring at a condemned building just seconds before the demolition charges detonate. Nathan pulled the microphone from the stand. He turned his back on Richard, leaving him standing completely helpless on his own stage, and faced the 200 wealthy guests. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the crystal chandeliers. "Good evening, everyone," Nathan said. His voice was deep, perfectly steady, and rolled through the massive speakers with absolute authority. "Please excuse the interruption. I know you are all incredibly eager to hear more about the brilliant legacy of Sterling Enterprises." Nathan paused, his eyes sweeping over the crowd until he found Arthur Pendleton and the board of directors sitting in the front row. Richard just delivered a truly fascinating speech. Nathan continued his tone perfectly, even completely devoid of sarcasm, which only made his words more devastating. He spoke eloquently about aggressive expansion. He spoke about elite market positions. But most importantly, he just spent the last 10 minutes profusely praising the holding company that is currently buying him out. Nathan turned his head slightly, looking over his shoulder at Richard, who was now sweating profusely under the stage lights. "You called Vanguard Acquisitions brilliant." "Richard," Nathan said, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You said they recognized your incredible value. You said they were the heavyweights of the industry. But you made one massive catastrophic miscalculation in your corporate strategy." Nathan turned back to face the audience, his gaze locking directly onto Evelyn, Patricia, and Brittany, who were all staring up at the stage in absolute paralyzed horror. "You have absolutely no idea who your daughter really is," Nathan announced. The words struck the room like a physical blow. "Vanguard Acquisitions did not partner with you because you built a valuable company," Nathan explained, his voice crystal clear. "Vanguard Acquisitions executed a hostile takeover because your company is completely bankrupt. They bought your warehouse mortgages. They acquired your equipment leases. They legally own the chairs you are currently sitting on. They did not come to partner with you, Richard. They came to liquidate you." Arthur Pendleton stood up from his chair, his face flushed with sudden anger and extreme confusion. "What is the meaning of this?" Arthur shouted toward the stage. "Who is running Vanguard Acquisitions?" Nathan did not point. He did not need to. He simply looked toward the back of the room, straight down the center aisle directly at me. The spotlight operator, sensing the massive shift in the room's gravity, swung the bright beam of light away from the stage and dragged it through the darkness until it landed perfectly on table 48. I stood up. The light caught the deep, rich fabric of my vintage emerald gown and ignited the heavy diamond necklace around my throat. I was no longer standing in the shadows. I was the absolute center of the universe. The entire ballroom turned in unison. 200 of the wealthiest people in Connecticut stared at the woman they had just dismissed as a pathetic, slow-witted secretary. They looked at the way I carried myself, the cold, unyielding power radiating from my posture, and the undeniable truth finally hit them. "She is," Nathan said quietly into the microphone, answering Arthur's question, as the entire room stared at me in complete, terrified silence. "Cassidy is Vanguard Acquisitions. And as of yesterday morning, she owns every single thing you possess." Nathan lowered the microphone. He did not say another word. He simply raised his left hand and gave a subtle practice signal to the audiovisual booth located on the second-floor balcony at the back of the ballroom. What my family and this Oakridge Country Club management did not know was that I had quietly bought out the venue contract for the entire evening. The technicians operating the lighting and sound were not country club staff. They were Vanguard corporate security and media personnel. The massive digital projector screen directly behind Richard suddenly flickered. The glowing Sterling Enterprises logo, which had been proudly displayed all evening as a symbol of untouchable generational wealth, vanished in an absolute instant. It was replaced by a stark, imposing black background featuring the sleek silver emblem of Vanguard Acquisitions. The screen quickly transitioned to display the heavily redacted but undeniably official corporate acquisition documents. The text was magnified so perfectly that even the guests sitting at the farthest back tables could read every single word. The primary clause was highlighted in a brilliant, unavoidable yellow. It detailed the complete, irrevocable transfer of all Sterling commercial debt, operational infrastructure, and holding assets. And right at the bottom of the page, beneath the bold title of Founder, Chief Executive Officer, and Majority Shareholder, was my full legal name. A collective echoing gasp rippled through the 200 elite guests. It was the distinct, terrifying sound of a high society paradigm shift. Wealthy investors leaned forward in their chairs, adjusting their glasses, completely unable to comprehend the absolute reality of what they were reading. The woman they had just dismissed as a pathetic, slow-witted secretary was officially the single most powerful person in the room. Richard slowly turned around on the stage to look at the massive screen. The remaining arrogance completely melted off his face, leaving behind the terrified, hollow expression of a man realizing he was entirely trapped inside his own burning house. His hand went limp. The delicate crystal champagne flute he had been holding for his grand celebratory toast slipped through his fingers. It shattered violently against the polished wooden floorboards of the stage, the sharp crash echoing loudly through the microphone and amplifying his total pathetic loss of control. Down at table 1, Aunt Patricia violently pushed her chair back and stood up. Her heavy diamond earrings shook frantically as she pointed a trembling finger toward the AV booth. "Turn that off immediately!" Patricia shrieked, her voice completely devoid of its usual refined old money polish. "This is a sick, tasteless prank. Turn it off right now. Richard, tell them to turn it off. She is just playing a pathetic game with the venue computers." I did not let her desperate, frantic delusion survive for more than a few seconds. I handed my glass of sparkling water to Nathan, who had stepped down from the stage to stand right by my side, and I began to walk. I moved gracefully down the long center aisle, the heavy emerald silk of my vintage gown flowing effortlessly around me. The crowd parted instinctively, pulling their chairs back to give me a wide path. They were completely silent, watching the woman they had ignored for hours suddenly command the gravity of the entire room. Every single step I took felt like a physical weight pressing down on the chests of my family members. "It is not a prank, Aunt Patricia," I said, my voice projecting clearly and coldly across the silent ballroom. "It is a highly certified, legally binding corporate foreclosure. Vanguard Acquisitions holds the mortgage to this exact building. We own the equipment leases for your warehouses. We completely control the Apex Logistics network. The company you thought you were passing down tonight has legally belonged to me for over a month." Arthur Pendleton, the chairman of the board, stared at me with his jaw slightly open. The absolute realization of his massive financial exposure hit him like a runaway freight train. He looked at Richard, who was still standing completely frozen on the stage, unable to formulate a single syllable of defense to protect his investors. I stopped walking when I reached the absolute center of the room, standing directly between Arthur and table 1. I looked at Richard briefly, but my primary target had completely shifted. I turned my attention to DeAndre and Brittany, who were shrinking back into their velvet chairs, desperately trying to become invisible in the shadows of their collapsing empire. But since Richard was just up there talking about dynamic leadership and aggressive corporate expansion, I continued reaching into my small clutch and pulling out a sleek black presentation remote. I think it is only fair that we examine the exact methods the new executive team used to optimize the company. Let us take a very close look at the $1.4 million you two funneled into dummy accounts just this past quarter. I pressed the small button on the remote. The massive screen behind Richard shifted instantly. The Vanguard acquisition documents vanished, replaced by Elena's highly detailed, undeniable forensic audit summaries. The screen was suddenly filled with glaring red numbers, complex wire transfer routing codes, and state business registration forms. I had specifically instructed my team to highlight the most egregious, undeniable theft from the last 3 months, knowing it would be the absolute most painful to watch. "You see, Arthur," I said, addressing the chairman of the board directly while never breaking my icy, predatory stare with DeAndre. DeAndre did not revolutionize the supply chain. He and his wife simply set up a massive network of completely fraudulent vendor LLCs. Horizon Consulting, Summit Logistics. These companies do not exist. They have absolutely no employees, no physical addresses, and provide zero actual services. I clicked the remote again. The massive screen split perfectly in half. On the left side were the approved corporate invoices signed directly by DeAndre for Phantom Consulting Services. On the right side were the corresponding personal bank statements and highly specific luxury retail receipts. DeAndre authorized a massive corporate payment for a fake operational audit. I explained, my voice echoing with absolute terrifying clarity. And exactly 2 days later, that exact amount of money was wired from the fake vendor account to a personal offshore trust to purchase Brittany's $5,000 custom silk gown, the exact same gown she is currently wearing tonight. Another fraudulent invoice paid for their premium penthouse upgrade in Aspen. Another fully covered their exclusive country club membership dues for the year. The entire ballroom turned their collective horrified gaze toward Brittany and DeAndre. Brittany gasped loudly, instinctively, crossing her arms over her chest, as if she could suddenly hide the stolen designer dress from the hundreds of furious investors staring at her. DeAndre looked like he was about to physically pass out. The color had completely vanished from his lips, and he was gripping the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles were pure white. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps, completely suffocated by the public exposure of his massive federal crimes. Patricia stood perfectly still next to her son, her mouth hanging completely open. The golden narrative she had aggressively built around her brilliant, highly successful boy was being publicly, violently dismantled right in front of her eyes. It was being entirely replaced by the undeniable, heavily documented proof that her son was nothing more than a parasitic thief who had drained his own family legacy to buy expensive clothes and hotel rooms. The absolute silence in the ballroom was finally broken by the sound of Arthur Pendleton picking up his cell phone and loudly telling his assistant to immediately contact the federal authorities. The absolute silence in the ballroom was finally broken by the sound of Arthur Pendleton picking up his cell phone and loudly telling his assistant to immediately contact the federal authorities. That single sentence acted like a spark hitting a massive pool of gasoline. Total, uncontainable chaos erupted across the Oakridge Country Club. 200 wealthy investors, socialites, and board members simultaneously sprang out of their chairs. The polite, refined atmosphere of the elite gala completely disintegrated into a frantic, shouting frenzy. Men in expensive tuxedos were desperately dialing their defense attorneys, their voices overlapping in a panicked chorus of legal demands and damage control. Women were gathering their designer purses, physically backing away from table one, as if the Sterling family had suddenly contracted a highly contagious lethal disease. At the absolute epicenter of the destruction, DeAndre completely unraveled. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy facade shattered into a million pathetic pieces. Sweat poured profusely down his forehead, soaking the collar of his $6,000 custom Italian suit. He stumbled backward, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over a crystal water pitcher, sending ice and water spilling across the silver silk tablecloth. "It is a misunderstanding," DeAndre stammered, his voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. He looked frantically at Arthur, then at the other board members, and finally at me. "Cassidy is lying. Those documents are manipulated. We have an agile workflow. The vendors are real. I swear the vendors are completely real." He was drowning blindly, grasping at the meaningless corporate buzzwords he had used to hide his incompetence for years. But nobody was listening to him anymore. The glaring red numbers glowing on the massive digital screen behind the stage were undeniable absolute proof. Before DeAndre could spin another pathetic lie, the most vicious betrayal came from the person standing directly next to him. Brittany, realizing that the massive luxury ship was sinking rapidly to the bottom of the ocean, immediately scrambled for a life raft. She turned on her husband with the speed and ferocity of a starving predator. "I had absolutely nothing to do with this," Brittany screamed, her voice cutting through the chaotic roar of the ballroom. She stepped away from DeAndre, her face crumpling into a mask of theatrical, hysterical tears. She pressed her hands against her cheeks, playing the ultimate innocent victim. "He told me the money was from his annual performance bonuses. He handled all the banking. I am just a wife. I do not know anything about logistics or shell companies. He lied to me just like he lied to all of you." DeAndre stared at his wife, his mouth opening and closing in sheer horrified disbelief. "Brittany, what are you doing?" he choked out, reaching a trembling hand toward her. "We signed those incorporation papers together. You picked the name for the consulting firm. Do not touch me, you absolute criminal!" Brittany shrieked dramatically, slapping his hand away. She looked around the room, desperately seeking a sympathetic audience among the outraged billionaires. "I am a victim of his financial abuse. I had no idea he was stealing from his own family." Aunt Patricia let out a guttural, horrified wail, watching her golden son and her prized daughter-in-law viciously tear each other apart in front of Connecticut high society. She grabbed her chest, hyperventilating as the grand illusion she had, worshipped her entire life, burned to ash. Up on the stage, Richard finally found his voice. He grabbed the microphone Nathan had left on the podium, his face a terrifying shade of purple. "Everyone, please remain calm," Richard bellowed desperately, trying to regain control of the room. "We can resolve this internally. Cassidy, turn off that screen immediately. I am still the chief executive officer of this company, and I order you to shut this down." I looked up at him, standing isolated on the stage. The sheer blinding audacity of his demand was almost poetic. I did not need a microphone to answer him. My voice was calm, razor-sharp, and carried the absolute, undeniable weight of total authority. "You are not the chief executive officer of anything, Richard," I said, projecting my words clearly across the panicked room. "Vanguard Acquisitions finalized the debt conversion yesterday morning. I own the building you are standing in. I own the microphone you are speaking into. And as the sole owner and majority shareholder, my first official act regarding this newly acquired subsidiary is a complete restructuring of the executive board." I turned my gaze slowly, making sure every single person in the room heard my next words. "Richard Sterling, DeAndre Sterling, and Brittany Sterling." I announced, my tone freezing the air around them. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. There will be no severance packages. There will be no golden parachutes. You are completely and permanently fired from the company you just spent 4 years actively destroying." Richard staggered backward, as if I had physically struck him in the chest. Evelyn buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into her linen napkin. And as for resolving this internally, I continued offering Richard a cold, empty smile. You are about 10 minutes too late for that. The files displayed on that screen were not just prepared for tonight's entertainment. The unredacted certified copies were hand-delivered to Harrison Vance and the State Financial Regulatory Board 3 hours ago. Right on cue, the heavy oak doors at the back of the ballroom violently swung open. A team of federal agents wearing dark suits and severe expressions marched into the room led by Harrison Vance. The remaining guests scrambled out of their way, pressing themselves against the walls to avoid getting caught in the massive legal crossfire. As the federal agents fanned out, moving directly toward Table 1 to detain DeAndre and Richard, I turned to Nathan. He offered me his arm, his expression completely serene amidst the absolute devastation surrounding us. We did not stay to watch them place the handcuffs on my family. We did not stay to listen to Patricia's unhinged screaming or Brittany's fake hysterical sobbing. We simply walked out of the Oakridge Country Club, stepping into the cool, crisp night air, leaving the burning ruins of the Sterling Empire completely behind us. Exactly 4 days later, the dust had barely begun to settle, but my reality had completely shifted. I was sitting behind my massive custom glass desk in the penthouse suite of Vanguard Acquisitions. The morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, peaceful shadows across the polished concrete floor. It was a beautiful, quiet Tuesday, completely disconnected from the absolute nightmare my family was currently living. My personal cell phone resting on the edge of the desk lit up with another incoming call. It was the 47th call I had received from a Sterling family member since Saturday night. My voicemail inbox was completely full of frantic, desperate messages from aunts, uncles, and cousins who had ignored my existence for 30 years, but suddenly wanted to remind me how much they had always loved me. I had not answered a single one. The intercom on my desk chimed softly. My executive assistant, Sarah, spoke, her tone highly professional, but laced with mild concern. Cassidy, I am so sorry to interrupt, but Richard and Patricia are currently in the lobby. Security tried to turn them away, but they are causing a massive scene. They are begging for a 5-minute meeting. They say it is an absolute family emergency. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, looking out at the sprawling city skyline. The Sterling family was finally experiencing the terrifying reality of consequences. I knew exactly why they were here. DeAndre was facing 20 years in federal prison for massive corporate fraud and tax evasion. Richard was facing similar charges for the pension embezzlement. Their bank accounts were frozen, their assets were seized, and their high society friends had entirely abandoned them. I was the absolute last resort. Send them up, I told Sarah, my voice perfectly calm. Have security escort them directly to my office. 5 minutes later, the heavy glass doors of my penthouse suite slid open. Richard and Patricia stepped inside, and the physical transformation they had undergone in just 4 days was absolutely staggering. They looked like they had aged 10 years. Richard was wearing a wrinkled suit that looked distinctly off the rack, his posture hunched and defeated. The arrogant, booming corporate titan was completely gone. Patricia looked even worse. Her perfect hair was messy, her designer makeup was smudged, and she was clutching her expensive handbag with trembling, desperate fingers. 2 large corporate security guards stood silently by the door, ensuring they did not make any sudden movements. Cassidy Richard breathed, his voice cracking, as he looked around the massive, incredibly expensive office suite. The undeniable proof of my wealth was everywhere, from the original modern art on the walls to the panoramic view of the financial district. I cannot believe you built all of this. It is incredible. You are incredible. Do not waste my time with cheap flattery, Richard. I said, not offering them a seat. I remained comfortably behind my glass desk, folding my hands together. You have exactly 3 minutes. What do you want? Patricia immediately burst into heavy, dramatic tears. She rushed forward, stopping just short of my desk. Cassidy, please, she sobbed, her voice dripping with forced, pathetic desperation. We are begging you. You have to call the federal prosecutors. You have to tell them the money was a corporate loan. You have to drop the civil charges against Vanguard Acquisitions. DeAndre will not survive in federal prison. He is just a boy. He made a stupid mistake. A $1.4 million mistake meticulously executed over 48 months is not a mistake. Aunt Patricia, I corrected her coldly. It is a highly coordinated career choice. Cassidy, please listen to us, Richard pleaded, taking a step closer, his hands clasped together as if in prayer. We are family. Family makes mistakes. Family fights. But at the end of the day, we have to stick together. We have to show unity and forgiveness. We always knew you were special, Cassidy. We always knew you had this incredible, brilliant spark inside of you. We were just trying to push you to reach your full potential. The absolute sickening hypocrisy of his words hung in the quiet air of my office. He was actually trying to spin 30 years of systemic emotional abuse and financial sabotage as a unique parenting strategy. He expected me to believe that burning my college acceptance letters and mocking me at every dinner table was somehow the catalyst for my success. I stood up slowly, placing my hands flat against the cold surface of the glass desk. The ambient noise of the city outside felt incredibly far away. You do not love me, Richard, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. And you certainly do not love me, Patricia. Do not stand in my office and preach to me about family unity and forgiveness. You only believe in family unity when you are the ones holding the whip. I walked around the desk, closing the distance until I was standing just a few feet away from them. They both instinctively shrank back, finally recognizing the lethal predator they had foolishly invited into their home for decades. You do not care about my brilliant spark, I continued, my words hitting them like physical strikes. You only care about my power. You love the fact that I am a multimillionaire who can afford the legal team required to pull your precious son out of a federal cage. You loved having a designated loser in the family. You loved having someone to kick so you could feel tall. But the problem is, Richard, you kicked me right into an empire. And now I am the one wearing the boots. Patricia fell to her knees, openly sobbing, burying her face in her hands. Please, Cassidy, she wailed. We will do anything. We will publicly apologize. We will give you whatever you want. Just do not let them take my son away. You have absolutely nothing left that I want, Patricia, I told her, looking down at her pathetic, trembling form with complete and total indifference. I already took everything. I looked up at the two security guards standing by the glass doors and gave them a simple, definitive nod. Escort them out of the building, I ordered, and permanently revoke their access to this floor. Richard tried to reach out to me, his face twisting in absolute panic as the guards stepped forward and firmly grabbed his arms. Cassidy, wait. Please. You cannot do this to your own blood. You cannot just throw us away. Watch me, I replied, turning my back on them and walking toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. I stood there looking out at the city I had quietly conquered, listening to the sounds of my family being forcibly dragged out of my corporate fortress. Their desperate pleas and hysterical sobbing faded down the hallway, completely silenced by the heavy swoosh of the elevator doors. The toxic, suffocating chapter of my life was permanently closed. I had finally burned their fraudulent kingdom to the ground, and from the ashes, I was going to build something absolutely magnificent. The swift and absolute justice that followed that morning in my office was nothing short of breathtaking. I did not entertain a single moment of toxic forgiveness. Society conditions women to be the peacemakers, to swallow their pride, and to endlessly forgive abusive family members simply because you happen to share the same bloodline. But I knew the absolute truth. Forgiving parasites does not heal them. It only teaches them that your boundaries are completely meaningless and that your peace is entirely up for negotiation. I refused to negotiate my peace ever again. Within 6 months, the federal hammer came down on DeAndre with terrifying force. The paper trail my team had handed over to Harrison Vance was so ironclad that DeAndre's high-priced defense attorneys begged him to take a plea deal. He was officially indicted on multiple counts of wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and tax evasion. The arrogant, untouchable golden boy who had once thrown a $20 bill onto my dinner plate was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Brittany, true to her fundamentally selfish nature, immediately filed for divorce the moment the indictments were unsealed. She desperately tried to spin a public narrative that she was the naive, manipulated wife who knew absolutely nothing about the stolen millions. But the federal prosecutors were not nearly as stupid as she hoped. Because her name was on the incorporation documents for the shell companies, they aggressively seized every single marital asset. The government repossessed her custom imported sports cars. They seized the funds used to pay for her exclusive country club memberships. They even confiscated her designer wardrobe, including the $5,000 silk gown she wore to the retirement gala because it had been purchased with stolen corporate funds. Brittany was left completely destitute. She was forced to move out of her sprawling estate and into a tiny, cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city. Worse than the financial ruin was the absolute social annihilation. She was permanently blacklisted from the corporate world and entirely exiled from Connecticut high society. The same wealthy women she used to drink champagne with now crossed the street to avoid making eye contact with her. As for Richard, he managed to narrowly avoid federal prison, but the cost was his total irreversible destruction. To stay out of a cell, he was forced to fully cooperate with the authorities and liquidate his entire personal estate to pay back a fraction of the employee pension fund he had stolen. The massive, sprawling mansion where I had endured my miserable childhood was sold at a public auction. Richard and Evelyn were forced to downsize to a small rented condo in a completely different zip code. The man who had spent his entire life building a monument to his own ego was left with absolutely nothing but the crushing weight of his public humiliation. He had no legacy, no fortune, and no power. Meanwhile, I went to work. I did not just restructure Sterling Enterprises. I completely eradicated its toxic history. The first thing I did was order a construction crew to physically remove the massive Sterling logo from the side of the corporate headquarters. We officially rebranded the subsidiary as Vanguard Logistics. I fired the compliant, corrupt board of directors who had enabled Richard's behavior for decades. I brought in my own team of brilliant, highly ethical executives. But my most important act as the new owner was fully restoring the employee pension fund out of Vanguard's own corporate capital. When the warehouse workers and mid-level managers realized I had personally guaranteed their retirements and fired the family that had been actively robbing them, their loyalty became absolute. Under my leadership, we stripped away the massive operational inefficiencies, eliminated the fraudulent vendor waste, and within 12 short months, Vanguard Logistics became one of the most highly profitable supply chain networks on the entire East Coast. Richard's so-called legacy was completely overwritten by my success. Exactly 1 year after the explosive country club gala, Nathan and I were standing on the expansive stone balcony of our private estate in upstate New York. The sun was just beginning to set over the rolling forested hills, painting the sky in deep, vibrant shades of violet and gold. The air was incredibly peaceful, filled only with the soft rustling of the wind through the massive oak trees. I leaned against the cool stone railing holding a glass of vintage red wine and rested my head against Nathan's shoulder. He wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close. We stood there in perfect unbroken silence, absorbing the absolute sanctuary we had built together. I looked out at the horizon, taking a slow, deep breath of the crisp evening air. For the first 34 years of my life, I believed that I was inherently flawed, because my family could not love me. I exhausted myself trying to fit into a mold that was designed to suffocate me. I let them convince me that I was a leaky bucket, a helpless secretary, a permanent disappointment. But standing on this balcony, looking at the breathtaking life I had built from the ground up, I finally understood the profound power of walking away. Cutting off toxic bloodlines is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. You do not owe your life, your success, or your sanity to people who only keep you around to absorb their poison. You are not required to set yourself on fire simply to keep your abusers warm. The moment I stopped seeking the approval of people who secretly wanted me to fail, I became completely unstoppable. My name is Cassidy, and I am living proof that the greatest revenge is not just exposing the people who hurt you. The greatest revenge is building a beautiful, massively successful life that they are permanently locked out of. If you are watching this right now, and you have a Richard, a Patricia, or a DeAndre in your own life, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You do not have to sit at their table anymore. You do not have to accept the terrible roles they assign to you. Your worth is not determined by their massive insecurities. You have the power to stand up, walk out the door, and build your own empire. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your peace? Have you ever had to stand up to someone who completely underestimated your worth? I would absolutely love to hear your stories of survival and karmic justice in the comments below. Let us build a community that celebrates walking away from toxic environments and stepping into our true power. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to hear more authentic stories of resilience, triumph, and unapologetic boundaries. Share this video with someone who might be struggling with difficult family dynamics today and remind them that they are allowed to choose their own peace. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being part of this incredible journey, and remember that your story is entirely yours to write.